deep within the shadowed canopies of America's forests, people have vanished without trace, leaving behind only the echo of footsteps, abandoned camps, or the faintest whisper of a trail. From remote mountain ridges to silent river valleys, their disappearances share an unsettling pattern, a quiet that lingers long after searchers have left. In this exploration, we trace the paths of the lost, hikers who walked into mist-shrouded clearings, hunters who never returned from dense pine thickets, families whose calls vanished into echoing hollows. Each forest conceals secrets, anomalies in terrain, and moments where the ordinary folds into the inexplicable. As we navigate these remote landscapes and sift through eyewitness accounts, park records, and chilling discoveries, the line between wilderness and the unknown begins to blur, revealing a hidden map of absence that stretches across the heart of the United States. The Bennington Triangle, the forest that swallowed 5. In the remote heart of Vermont's Green Mountains, where the ridgelines of Glastonbury rise into mist and pine, there stretches a tract of wilderness that locals once called cursed. It was here, between 1945 and 1950, that 5 people vanished under circumstances so peculiar that the region would earn a name whispered ever since: the Bennington Triangle. The land's quiet menace was not born in the modern age. Long before European settlers arrived, the Abenaki people avoided Mount Glastonbury, speaking of it as a place where the winds carried wrong voices and where the ground itself was not to be trusted. Others said the mountain's slopes formed a great vortex, drawing travellers inward and never releasing them. The first to vanish was Midi Rivers, a seasoned hunting guide and lifelong resident of the region. It was late November 1945, the woods drenched from days of cold rain. Rivers led a group of 4 hunters along the Hell Hollow Brook, a place known for its tangled undergrowth and narrow ravines. He walked ahead of them, following the trail up a slight incline. When the others crested the ridge moments later, he was gone. Authorities combed miles of forest over the following weeks. Hundreds of volunteers, bloodhounds, even aircraft. Yet no clothing, no rifle, no trace of him was ever found. The searchers noted how sound carried strangely in that valley, echoing in ways that disoriented even locals. Others suspected he'd simply wandered off the trail and succumbed to the cold. But hunters of his experience did not simply lose their sense of direction in the country they'd known since childhood. The second case came the following year and gave the forest a reputation beyond Vermont's borders. Paula Jean Weldon, an 18-year-old student from Bennington College, set out on a December afternoon in 1946 to hike the Long Trail, which crossed through Glastonbury Mountain's dense heart. Witnesses later reported seeing her along the trail's lower entrance, her bright coat visible against the fading snowlight, before she disappeared into the trees. When she failed to return, the college and state police launched one of the largest searches Vermont had ever seen. Air patrols mapped every ridge, hundreds of volunteers scoured the mountainside, and psychics were even consulted in desperation. Yet not a single item of her clothing, not one footprint beyond the trailhead, was ever recovered. The red coat that might have glowed like a beacon in the forest had vanished as if the mountain had consumed it. By now, the locals had begun to speak of a pattern, of a stretch of wilderness that erased its visitors. Over the next few years, the disappearances continued, each with its own strange symmetry. In 1949, a man named James Tedford, a veteran and resident of the Bennington Soldiers' Home, boarded a bus bound for Bennington after visiting family in St. Albans. Passengers remembered seeing him in his seat as the bus neared town, his luggage stored neatly beside him. When it arrived at its final stop, Tedford was gone. His belongings remained on the seat. His open timetable lay on his lap, untouched. Some argued that his case did not belong among the forest vanishings, but the direction of his route, through Glastonbury's wooded foothills, tied it to the growing legend of the Triangle. In 1950, the forest took 2 more. That October, 8-year-old Paul Jepson vanished while his mother tended pigs at the family's dump on the outskirts of Bennington. The boy had been playing nearby, wearing a bright red jacket, eerily similar to the one Paula Weldon had worn 4 years earlier. Moments later, he was gone. The following month, Frida Langer, an experienced hiker and outdoors woman, slipped into a stream while hiking near Somerset Reservoir, several miles from the earlier disappearances. She told her cousin she would return to camp to change into dry clothes. She never arrived. Search teams, aircraft and trackers spent weeks combing the area. Then, 6 months later, her body was discovered in a clearing that had been extensively searched before. The cause of death was never determined. By the time Frida's body was found, the legend of the Bennington Triangle had taken hold. Reporters from across New England arrived to document the series of vanishings, noting their proximity in both geography and time. All occurred within a narrow radius surrounding Mount Glastonbury. All involved or experienced individuals familiar with the outdoors, and all left behind no conclusive trace. No sign of struggle, no weather event to explain sudden disappearance. Skeptics have long sought rational explanations. The terrain itself is treacherous, carved with hidden sinkholes, abandoned mine shafts and sudden drops. Glastonbury's soil, loose and uneven, can swallow the weight of a person in certain conditions. Others cited hypothermia or disorientation, the Benedict syndrome, as some local wardens call it, a phenomenon where cold-induced confusion drives victims deeper into the wilderness rather than back towards safety. Yet none of these explanations address the sheer absence of trace, nor the way the disappearances seem to form an invisible boundary around the same haunted mountain. Decades later, the forest remains almost entirely uninhabited. The ghost towns of Fayville and Glastonbury, once small logging communities, lie in ruins along the mountain slopes. Their remnants, cellar holes, collapsed foundations, rusted stove parts, sit half-buried beneath ferns. Hikers report a pervasive sense of stillness, a pressure in the air as if the forest listens. Compasses have been said to behave erratically near the old mining sites, needles trembling without wind. Modern GPS devices sometimes fail to hold signal within certain hollows. Even the name Bennington Triangle, coined years after the events, feels too simple for what occurred there. The forest is not an ordinary landscape. It is a silence shaped by absence, a place that has consumed both people and explanation. Each new case was quietly folded into the myth, and the myth into the soil. Today, Mount Glastonbury is a conservation area. Its trails are thin and rarely used. There are moments, say those who have stood there alone, when the forest seems to inhale, and the quiet deepens to something close to sentience. And in that stillness, it is said, the forest waits for the next name it will take. The missing children of Mesa Verde. Rangers still mark the place on certain maps, though few go there now. The route winds along a sunburned ridge in southwestern Colorado, ending in a tangle of sandstone alcoves and abandoned kivas. From a distance, the cliffs resemble a wall of honey-coloured bone, weathered by centuries of desert wind. It was here, in the summer of 1951, that 3 children from the nearby town of Mancos vanished while hiking the old trail that borders the Mesa Verde ruins. Their names, Thomas and Andrew Larkin, aged 10 and 12, and their cousin Michael, 9, appear in a handful of regional reports, then fade into silence. Centuries before the road reached this plateau, an older silence ruled here. The ancestral Puebloans built their stone dwellings beneath these cliffs, carving homes directly into the mesa walls. Generations later, archaeologists would describe their departure as one of the great migrations of the American Southwest, entire communities abandoning the settlements for reasons still debated. Some speak of drought, others suggest conflict or spiritual renewal. The ruins remain in remarkable condition, granaries still intact, plaster handprints still visible. To early explorers, Mesa Verde felt like a ghost preserved in rock. To the locals, it was something less still, something that waited. When the boys failed to return by dusk, their families searched the ledges with lanterns. The light trembled across sandstone shelves and juniper roots, revealing footprints that stopped near an ancient dwelling known as Balcony House. No signs of struggle, no broken branches, no blood. The only evidence that 3 children had ever walked that path were a few scuffed impressions in the dust, vanishing near a shallow crevice that led nowhere. Their fathers called out through the night, voices echoing off the canyon walls until they seemed to call back from every direction at once. Witnesses told the sheriff conflicting versions of the same hour. A park ranger swore he had seen the boys near the visitor overlook around 5 in the evening. Another hiker claimed he heard laughter echoing from Spruce Tree Canyon much later. Search teams noted strange discrepancies in time, watches that lost minutes, compass needles that spun briefly before steadying again. To most, these were dismissed as stress or the effect of the altitude. Yet a few older residents of Mancos spoke quietly of other disappearances stretching back decades, most never reported beyond county lines. The search teams advanced methodically, sweeping the scrub oak and pinyon pine. More than 100 volunteers joined in, rangers, locals, even air patrols scanning the mesa from above. Dogs tracked the scent down a steep wash before abruptly losing it at a sheer drop of 60 feet. Ropes were lowered, lights combed the cliff base, but nothing was found. Rain came 2 days later, erasing what little trace remained. By the 5th day, officials reduced the operation, convinced the children had fallen or become lost in one of the labyrinthine side canyons. Still, no bodies, clothing or personal items were ever recovered. Among the official notes lies a curious detail. The birds went quiet that afternoon. One of the rangers later described it in a statement, how the constant chatter of sparrows and swifts fell silent all at once, leaving only the wind. He said the stillness lasted less than a minute before the sound returned as though nothing had changed. Others in the search group reported the same phenomenon over the following week, at seemingly random intervals. No scientific explanation was recorded, and the incident remains a footnote in the park's archives, filed under environmental observation. Modern studies of the mesa's geology mention magnetic interference along its cliffs. Geophysicists measuring the basalt layers near the ruins noted small, fluctuating anomalies. Nothing dramatic, but strong enough to disturb compasses and early radio signals. The phenomenon is thought to result from iron-rich sediments interacting with lightning strikes over centuries. Yet to some rangers who worked the park through the 1960s, the readings seem to cluster around the same area where the boys had disappeared. Several maps from that era show hand-drawn circles, marking the zones of strongest distortion, overlapping the Balcony House Trail. Whether coincidence or pattern no one could tell. To stand there now is to feel both the past and the present watching from the stone. The ruins glow gold in late afternoon, shadows gathering beneath the alcoves like water. Tourists still walk the trail, though few linger near the outer ledges where the old search began. Occasionally a guide will mention the lost children, their story folded into the broader mystery of the mesa's history. Others prefer silence. When the wind rises through the canyon, it carries a faint whistling hum that some say resembles voices. Archaeologists call it aeolian resonance, the sound of air passing through ancient openings in the cliff face. But to those who have heard it alone at dusk, it feels like something older, something that never left. Beneath the layers of sandstone, the ancestral Puebloans built small tunnels and hidden chambers whose purposes remain unclear. Excavations in the 1970s uncovered one such passage, sealed by stack stones and ochre pigment. Inside, the floor bore the footprints of children preserved in hardened clay, leading toward a wall that ended abruptly. The discovery reignited interest in the 1951 case for a brief time, though no link was proven. Still, among the rangers, there lingers an unease that certain parts of the mesa are best left undisturbed, that its silence is not simply absence but memory. Those who visit after dark speak of lights moving between the cliffs, soft and bluish like lanterns underwater. The park attributes them to atmospheric refraction or distant vehicles along the highway, though photographs show nothing beyond vague orbs of mist. Every few years a hiker reports hearing children's laughter, echoing faintly from the canyons, always fading before its source can be found. These stories are never publicised, quietly recorded in incident logs and stored away with the others. The mesa keeps its own records, etched not in ink but in absence, a memory written only in stone and silence. The disappearance of Dennis Martin, the Smoky Mountains enigma. It began with a family outing measured in hours and distances under a sky too calm for what followed. The Martin family had chosen the first day of summer, June 14, 1969, for their hike through the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The weather was mild, the forecast clear, and the forests around Spencefield shimmered in early light. Dennis Martin, 6 years old, was the youngest of the group. Curious, quick, and quiet. He had followed his father, William, and his brother Douglas along the Appalachian Trail from Cades Cove to the high meadow that marked the Tennessee-North Carolina border. Around 4 in the afternoon, with other families nearby, the boys planned a small prank. They would hide behind bushes and jump out to startle the adults. Moments later, only one child reappeared. The Smokies have a way of concealing scale. every valley looks nearer than it is. Beneath the ridgelines, folds of rhododendron and laurel weave a kind of green labyrinth, absorbing sound and disorienting direction. The area around Spence Field, though popular with hikers, borders deep, rugged hollows that drop abruptly into dense undergrowth. Rangers later noted that a person could walk a dozen steps off trail and vanish from sight completely. Maps show the area as open meadow bordered by forest, but beneath those trees lie sinkholes, thickets and streams that twist unseen for miles. To an adult, it is a wilderness of shadows. To a child, it might seem endless. Search reports from that era often noted how quickly fog could descend here, rolling down from Thunderhead Mountain in minutes, erasing trails and landmarks. Even before 1969, rangers had documented several disappearances in the same sector, most involving experienced hikers who had simply walked out of view and were never found again. At first, it was only a game, a child stepping behind a bush for a prank that should have lasted seconds. His father called his name, laughing, expecting a rustle or a giggle in reply. When the silence stretched too long, the laughter faded. William Martin moved quickly through the clearing, then ran, circling the bushes, calling louder. Within minutes, his voice carried through the meadow and down into the trees. There were no footprints, no trail of broken branches, nothing but stillness. A nearby family, the Key family from Huntsville, joined in the search, spreading through the field and tree line. By sundown, the light was gone, and the mountain began to close around them. Within minutes, the woods felt larger than anyone remembered. The Martins shouted until their voices were hoarse, the echoes folding back from unseen slopes. The night brought cold rain that blurred the ground and drowned the sound of movement. Rangers were alerted before midnight, and by dawn the next morning the first official search had begun. Experienced trackers from the National Park Service and the Civil Air Patrol joined with local volunteers. They combed the hollows, followed creek beds and checked animal trails. Nothing turned up. No scraps of clothing, no footprints, no prints from small shoes. The forest had taken him completely, and with the rain even the evidence of passage was gone. By the second day the mountain had become a grid of human effort. More than 1,400 people joined the operation, the largest search in the park's history at that time. Green Berets from Fort Bragg were called in to assist, moving silently through the mist. Helicopters hovered low over the ridges, dropping flares to mark sections already covered. Dogs were brought in, though their handlers noted something strange. The scent trail would begin strongly near the point of disappearance, then fade abruptly within a few yards, as though the boy had stepped into air. One tracker described the sensation of walking in circles within a place that refused to yield. In total, more than 50 square miles were searched, yet not a single piece of evidence was found. Yet beneath the order of the search, there were things that resisted explanation. A few miles south, near Rowan's Creek, another search party reported hearing what they called a child's scream, echoing through the gorge on the night of the disappearance. High, brief, and cut short. Heavy rain followed immediately after, preventing investigation. Days later, a man from Knoxville named Harold Key reported seeing a figure moving through the woods near the same area, carrying something over its shoulder. He'd been picnicking with his family when they heard a shriek from the hills, followed by movement in the brush. The figure, he said, appeared rough-looking, possibly a man, though he could not be certain. When the report reached investigators, it was noted but never confirmed. The distance between the two locations, over 6 miles of steep terrain, led some to dismiss it as unrelated, yet others quietly wondered how a 6-year-old could have travelled so far without a trace. Long after the reports were filed, the case refused to rest. The FBI remained involved for years, maintaining correspondence with the Martin family and monitoring new leads. In 1985, a ginseng hunter in the park discovered a small skeletal set of remains in a ravine near Big Hollow, an area less than 3 miles from Spence Field. The bones were consistent with a young child's, but by the time rangers arrived, the man had left, unwilling to reveal the exact location. Despite multiple searches of the reported site, no remains were recovered. In 2014, a forensic review of the case found no conclusive evidence linking any later discoveries to Dennis Martin. The official status remains unchanged, missing, presumed dead. Today the valley looks unchanged, but those who walk it say the air feels watched. The forest has reclaimed every footprint, every trail marker from that long search. Rangers sometimes find old ribbons tied to trees, weathered remnants from the 1969 operation, and leave them untouched. In fog, the meadow at Spencefield appears to move, the grass bending in waves as though something large passes unseen beneath it. Visitors report hearing distant calls that sound like names carried by the wind from no direction. One ranger, writing anonymously years later, said the silence there has a pulse, like the mountain remembering. Somewhere between the trees and the silence, a single moment remains unaccounted for. The strange silence of Crater Lake. The water at Crater Lake is too blue to seem real, a colour that absorbs sound as much as it reflects light. On calm days, the surface becomes a near-perfect mirror, showing not even the faintest ripple when the wind dies. Visitors often describe the silence as physical, as if sound itself refuses to cross the rim. Even the usual mountain echoes vanish, leaving only the hush of something immense and self-contained. Those who arrive expecting the hum of a national park, the insects, the murmur of tourists, the distant engines, instead find themselves whispering without knowing why. Long before it became a national park, this place was spoken of in warnings. Over 7,000 years ago, Mount Mazama erupted with such violence that its summit collapsed inward, forming the immense caldera now filled by snowmelt and rain. The eruption scattered ash as far as present-day Canada and left behind a crater nearly 6 miles wide. The Klamath and Modoc tribes preserved this event in their oral histories, describing a battle between the sky god Skell and the underworld god Lao. The crater was said to be where Lao fell, and where the earth sealed itself to contain him. When settlers reached this isolated plateau in the late 19th century, they noted the unnatural stillness and the absence of birds near the rim. Even their horses, witnesses wrote, refused to approach the edge. In the records of the Park Service, the missing are often last seen near the rim, where the wind stops suddenly. Some vanish while taking photographs, others during short hikes between lookouts. A handful of boats were found adrift on the lake's glassy surface, and their occupants were never recovered. Rangers have noted that radio signals fail near certain cliffs, a detail that complicates search efforts. In several disappearances, witnesses recalled that the air grew heavy moments before the person was gone, as though the entire basin paused mid-breath. Despite extensive searches, few traces were ever recovered, and even fewer explanations were held. Even sound behaves differently here. Researchers have measured how voices, when shouted across the lake, lose clarity within seconds, not to distance but to absorption. The lake's steep volcanic walls trap and mute echoes instead of returning them. Acoustic engineers have suggested that the crater's shape refracts sound waves downward, scattering them into the water before they can return. A whisper near the shore sometimes travels farther underwater than above it, as though the lake favours one world of sound over another. In 1982, a small study by Oregon State University recorded prolonged frequency drops near the southern rim, where low tones, below human hearing, seemed to pulse at irregular intervals. The researchers called them natural infrasounds, though they never located their source. The case of Charles McCullough remains the lake's quietest echo. In 1975, the young photographer set out alone from Virginia to document the park in winter. He was 23, carrying only a camera and a small pack. When he failed to return, a search party spent weeks combing the frozen terrain, fighting waist-deep snow and temperatures below zero. 2 years later, his remains were found in a remote canyon 6 miles from where he was last seen. Bones and torn fabric half buried in volcanic soil. His jeans were unbuttoned and folded neatly beside him. The rest of his clothing was missing. His keys and camera tripod were found nearby, untouched by rust. Rangers who discovered the scene described it as too clean, as if time had passed differently there. The coroner's report listed no cause of death. His parents later said they believed he had been drawn toward the lake by something he couldn't name. Scientific instruments describe the lake with precision, yet none account for its silences. At nearly 2,000 feet deep, Crater Lake is one of the purest bodies of water on Earth. No inflowing or outflowing streams disturb its equilibrium. The water is so clear that objects can be seen more than 100 feet below the surface. Early 20th century surveyors reported compass needles spinning erratically on the western rim, attributing it to magnetic ore in the volcanic rock. Later studies confirmed localized magnetic interference, but could not replicate the strongest readings. Hydrophones lowered into the depths have occasionally captured low rhythmic pulses, spaced evenly like a slow heartbeat. In 2006, divers from the US Geological Survey recorded sudden temperature drops of up to 20 degrees within minutes, though the lake showed no sign of volcanic activity or mixing currents. Geologists attribute them to shifting magma chambers, though no measurable seismic activity accompanies them. To the Klamath people, the crater was never meant to be approached. Elders described the waters as a threshold, not a symbol, but a true boundary between this world and another. They warned that those who looked too long into the lake risked being claimed by it. Stories told of lights moving beneath the surface and shadows walking along the cliffs after dusk. During rituals, no songs were sung toward the basin. Silence itself was considered the proper offering. Anthropologists in the early 1900s recorded accounts of warriors who vanished after glimpsing faces beneath the water, faces that smiled before dissolving. Even now, tribal guides tell visitors not to throw stones into the lake. It is, they say, listening. Today, the silence is treated like part of the landscape. Tourists pause mid-sentence without realizing it. Film crews report unexplained drops in audio levels when recording along the rim. Sound engineers studying the phenomenon describe it as frequency starvation, where natural ambient noise simply disappears. Rangers claim that even their radios, which function perfectly elsewhere in the park, often produce a soft, rhythmic static near the crater's center, as though something beneath is answering in its own frequency. Drones lose altitude unexpectedly, their sensors mistaking the lake's surface for sky. At sunset, the mirror turns black and still, and the forest around it seems to hold its breath until night fully settles. Beneath that flawless mirror lies a depth so calm it feels aware of who is missing. The Yosemite vanishings, the valley that watches. At sunrise, the granite walls of Yosemite catch the light like open eyes. The valley below remains dim for a few minutes longer, its rivers muttering beneath the weight of mist. Shadows bend across the meadow where elk still graze, oblivious to the watchfulness that seems to live in the stone. To most, Yosemite is a cathedral of nature. To others, it feels more like an observer, vast and silent, studying whoever dares to walk too far into its reach. In the earliest accounts of those who entered the valley, travelers wrote that the landscape seemed to rearrange itself in fog. John Muir himself noted how trails would vanish in shifting light, how echoes rebounded in places where no cliff stood near enough to catch them. Even before paved roads reached this high country, prospectors and rangers reported missing companions who were there one moment and gone the next, leaving no trace but a dropped tool or half-buried boot. The vast granite corridors of the Sierra Nevada became a place where distance behaved strangely, where sight could not be trusted, and where the forest seemed capable of swallowing sound. There was no sound when the first vanishing occurred, only sunlight wavering for an instant before returning to stillness. In 1957, a ranger station near Yosemite Falls documented the disappearance of a hiker named George P. Adams. He was last seen crossing a bridge toward the lower falls, a short walk from the main trailhead. Searchers combed the area for weeks, following footprints that led to a slick outcropping, and stopped there, abruptly, with no sign of a fall. The river below was too shallow to conceal a body, and divers found nothing. Adams became the first entry in a growing catalogue of disappearances that shared the same strange geography: sudden silence, perfect weather, and vanishing without a trace. The same faint pattern resurfaced decades later, aligning again with the invisible border dot. In 1981, 14-year-old Stacy Arras was camping with a group near Sunrise High Sierra Camp, east of Yosemite Valley. She told her father she would walk a short distance to photograph a nearby lake. Witnesses saw her take only a few steps down the slope before she disappeared behind a cluster of boulders, and never re-emerged. The search was one of the largest in park history, involving helicopters, search dogs, and dozens of volunteers. Yet nothing of her was ever found beyond her camera lens cap, lying in the dust beside the trail. Rangers later noted that the spot she vanished from was clear, open, and visible from several vantage points. It was as if she'd been erased mid-step. The search teams speak of the terrain as if it resists them. Those who joined the 1981 operation reported losing radio contact for hours at a time. Helicopter pilots described strange turbulence when circling certain ridgelines, though the air was calm elsewhere. In later incidents, such as the 2015 case of a missing hiker near Hetch Hetchy, thermal imaging scans returned inconsistent results, showing brief flickering heat signatures that vanished when approached on foot. Experienced trackers said it felt as though the park concealed its own pathways, rearranging landmarks to mislead pursuit. In the summer of 1966, park ranger Theodore Ted Glick vanished while conducting a wildlife survey near the Cathedral Lakes Basin. His colleagues found his field pack neatly placed on a granite shelf beside an unmarked path. A week later, search teams discovered his notebook lodged in a crevice 20 feet above where the trail should have ended. The last entry reading only, "Heard movement behind me." No signs of struggle or fall were ever found. The incident was quietly filed under unresolved disappearance, yet veteran rangers still reference it when training new recruits, a reminder of how swiftly the valley can turn observer into subject. Even instruments fail to agree on what the valley contains. Park technicians have recorded fluctuating magnetic readings along the Merced River Canyon, particularly near granite walls where iron-rich rock disrupts compasses. GPS signals sometimes drift dozens of meters from their true coordinates, and radio transmissions bend unexpectedly around cliff faces. Climbers on El Capitan have reported their altimeters dropping by hundreds of feet mid-ascent, as though the mountain itself distorted its own height. None of these anomalies directly explain the disappearances, yet all contribute to a sense that Yosemite's geography behaves with quiet defiance, a landscape aware of its own observers. Those who work here long enough begin to feel that they are not alone, even in silence. Rangers tell of hearing footsteps pacing just outside their tents after midnight. Though patrol logs confirm no one nearby, hikers describe voices echoing across valleys where no other groups were present. In 1999, a pair of backpackers near Glacier Point claimed to see a figure standing among the trees, perfectly still, watching them for several minutes before fading into the dusk. Their report was dismissed as exhaustion, yet it matched dozens of others made across decades. Glimpses of presence, unrecorded but persistent. Recent reviews of Yosemite's missing persons files reveal an unsettling consistency. Many cases describe experienced hikers who vanished within minutes of last contact, often in daylight and near populated routes. The National Park Service's own investigative summaries note that recovery rates here are lower than in comparable wilderness areas, though the reasons remain speculative. Some rangers quietly keep their own informal maps, not of trails or overlooks, but of the locations where search dogs have refused to advance. The same coordinates appear again and again, as if the valley keeps marking its own history in silence. Each summer, the valley fills again with voices unaware of what still listens. Dozens have gone missing in Yosemite National Park under identical, haunting circumstances that no official report can connect. They vanish under blue skies within sight of trails in places scoured repeatedly by rescuers. No single theory endures. Not wildlife, not terrain, not human interference. What remains is the shared silence of the valley itself. A silence that feels deliberate, almost protective, as though the land chooses when to release its secrets and when to keep them buried. Between the cliffs and the river, the valley remembers what the living forget. The case of the vanished prospector, Mount Shasta, 1934. In the spring of 1934, when the snows began to retreat from Mount Shasta's slopes, a lone prospector set out along the southern approach of the mountain and never returned. The air that season was clear and thin, the forest ringing with the melt of distant streams, yet the peak remained as it always had, vast, detached, and strangely watchful. Locals later said the man was last seen near Panther Meadow, a high-altitude clearing sacred to the Wintu people for generations. They believed the mountain was alive, that its interior held passages to another world, and that those who wandered too deep might be taken without struggle or sound. The man who walked into those woods was known only by his trade, not his name. Reports described him as middle-aged, carrying a worn canvas satchel and a pickaxe dulled by years of use. He told a supply clerk in Sisson, what is now the town of Mount Shasta, that he had traced a line of gold-bearing quartz somewhere near the upper ridges. To those who met him, he seemed certain of his find, certain that fortune waited just beneath the snowmelt. No one knew where he came from, but he moved like someone who had crossed mountains before. Days later, when his tent was found still standing, his tools laid in order, beside a half-cooked meal, the ground offered no sign of struggle or retreat. Rescuers came in waves, trudging through ash and alpine fog, their lanterns flickering against the white. The sheriff's team covered miles of ridges and lava fields, while volunteers combed the meadows and ravines that branched from the timberline. Bloodhounds were brought up from Reading, but the scent trails they followed twisted into circles and vanished near a patch of scorched ground that smelled faintly of sulphur. Searchers reported hearing echoes that did not match their own movements, as though someone else, somewhere deeper in the fog, walked in rhythm beside them. For 9 days they scoured every approach, but the mountain kept its silence. When the operation ended, no tracks, no tools, and no remains were recovered. Old survey logs from that decade mentioned sudden compass deviations along the same ridgeline, as if the magnetic field itself wavered whenever mist passed through. What followed the failed search was a maze of contradictions and half-truths. Newspapers in San Francisco printed brief stories about the disappearing miner of Shasta, though none could verify his name. One article claimed his camp had been found inside a cave that wasn't marked on any survey map. Another insisted the man had been seen days after the search ended, walking barefoot along a creek and speaking incoherently about lights under the mountain. The Forest Service denied both accounts. Meanwhile, members of the local Wintu community warned that the area near Panther Meadow was not a place for the living to dig. The mountain, they said, had its own keepers, spirits who guarded its hidden chambers. Years after the search was called off, those who lived nearest the mountain still spoke of the lights. Hikers reported faint blue glows that drifted between the trees on windless nights, and pilots flying over the summit described sudden flashes below the snowline, as though something metallic reflected the moon from within. In the 1950s, a geologist named Richard Price documented magnetic anomalies on the mountain's southern face that caused compasses to spin erratically. He concluded the readings could be caused by underground lava tubes rich in magnetite. Yet the old-timers in town remembered the vanished prospector and claimed that whatever drew him there had never gone quiet. Time eroded the trail, but not the story. Each new decade brought another disappearance. Hunters, hikers, and even a forest ranger who was last seen near the same ridge where the prospector's camp once stood. Their cases were logged separately, their names scattered across reports and archives. Yet each account circled the same coordinates. In one, a park official wrote that a search party found a boot print embedded in volcanic soil, perfectly preserved and facing uphill, though no prints led to or from it. In another, a climber's camera was recovered months later, the final photograph showing a blur of light at the edge of the frame, pale and spherical like an orb suspended in mist. The records of the 1934 case still exist in fragments: the sheriff's notes, a few grainy photographs, and a letter from a ranger who refused to continue the search. In that letter, dated June 3rd, he described hearing a low vibration beneath the ground, like a train far below the earth. He wrote that he could not explain why, but the feeling of being watched never left him until he descended the mountain. The letter ends abruptly, mid-sentence, as if interrupted. Some believe he merely stopped writing, others say he could not finish describing what he saw next. Mount Shasta has long carried a reputation for strange disappearances and stranger beliefs. Between 1904 and 1956, at least 7 unexplained vanishings were recorded on its southern slopes, their reports archived by Siskiyou County officials, but never linked to one another. During the late 19th century, Theosophical societies claimed the peak hid a lost civilization called Lemuria, whose descendants lived in tunnels beneath the snow. Others spoke of mysterious men in white robes seen emerging from the forest at dusk, always silent, their eyes reflecting the torchlight. Modern historians dismiss these stories as folklore born from isolation and the mountain's optical illusions. But even the skeptics admit that the geography itself, its labyrinth of crevasses, its sudden weather shifts, and its sound-distorting basalt formations, creates an atmosphere unlike anywhere else in the Pacific Ranges. To this day, the prospector's name remains unknown, his records incomplete, his final path lost beneath shifting rock and memory. Mount Shasta still draws seekers of fortune, mystics, and wanderers searching for something nameless in its silence. The rangers who patrol its upper slopes say there are places where radios cut to static, where the temperature drops suddenly and where the air hums faintly for no discernible reason. In those places, they say, the mountain feels awake, and some say the mountain still calls for the one it never gave back. The disappearance of Paula Jean Weldon, the path that ended nowhere. The story starts on a mild December afternoon, when a college student decided to walk into the woods. The air was unusually gentle for Vermont in 1946, the kind that dulled sound and made the sky look closer than it should. Paula Jean Weldon, dressed in a bright red parka, left the campus of Bennington College and walked south toward the foothills of Glastonbury Mountain. She told her roommate she was going for a short hike and never returned. The ease of her departure, no packed bag, no planned journey, would become one of the many details that refused to make sense. She was 20, self-reliant, and known for the small red parka she wore against the winter wind. Born in Stamford, Connecticut, Paula was described by her professors as quiet but determined, someone who preferred books and solitary walks to gatherings. Her classmates remembered her fascination with the woods surrounding the college, dense, uneven forests that merged into the unmarked wilderness of the Green Mountains. On the afternoon of December 1st, she was seen reading on her bed, then closing her textbook, tucking her hair beneath a scarf, and leaving the dormitory without a word. What followed would become one of New England's most scrutinized disappearances, one that reshaped the state's entire approach to missing persons. Several witnesses recalled seeing her along the road, her stride steady, her direction certain. A store clerk near Woodford saw her pass by close to dusk, walking alone along Route 9, a red figure fading against the grey horizon. Another man, driving the same stretch, noted that she turned toward a narrow trail leading into the woods, near the entrance to the Long Trail, the oldest long-distance hiking route in the United States. The sun was sinking behind the ridgeline. She carried no supplies, no flashlight, and no clear destination. When the light fell completely, the forest grew impenetrable, and by morning she was gone. When she failed to return, the search began without structure, as if Vermont itself was unprepared for the idea of her absence. Bennington College suspended classes, and hundreds of volunteers, students, professors, farmers, and soldiers from a nearby camp combed through the surrounding forests, but there was no central authority to coordinate the search. Vermont had no state police at the time. The local sheriff and state's attorney clashed over who was in charge. Days turned into nights filled with lanterns swaying through fog, footprints appearing and vanishing in mud, and rumours spreading faster than official reports. By the end of the week they had found no trace. Not a scrap of clothing, not a broken branch, not a sound. Leads emerged quickly, and collapsed just as fast. A waitress in Massachusetts claimed to have served a young woman matching Paula's description days after she vanished. Another report placed her in Albany, seen boarding a bus alone. But every alleged sighting dissolved under scrutiny. The ground search, which extended through early winter, found only deceptive hints. Patches of disturbed soil that turned out to be animal tracks, a trail of red threads that led nowhere. Even a reward offered by her father, a well-known engineer from Connecticut, produced nothing but false confessions. Each theory folded into the same absence, leaving behind the impression that Paula had simply stepped off the edge of the known world. Theories filled the void where facts would not settle. Some investigators suggested she ran away, though she had no money and had left behind all her personal belongings. Others argued an accident. Perhaps she lost her footing and fell into one of the steep ravines along the trail, hidden by snow or water. There were also darker suspicions of foul play or abduction, fueled by unverified claims of a stranger seen near the trailhead that evening. Paula's father grew increasingly frustrated with local authorities, accusing them of inexperience and mismanagement. The tension between him and the county officials became so public that it helped push Vermont to form its first official state police force the following year, a lasting consequence born from one girl's disappearance. The Long Trail runs north through ridges that seem to fold in on themselves. It passes through shadowed valleys and steep gullies where compasses falter, following a route once used by loggers, trappers and hunters. The section near Glastonbury Mountain, where Paula was last seen, has a reputation even among seasoned hikers, a landscape of abrupt weather shifts and disorienting silence. Later disappearances in the same area would echo her case with unnerving precision. Experienced hikers who set out alone and were never found, missing without evidence of struggle. locals began to whisper that the woods themselves were claiming what was owed. Decades later, this cluster of vanishings would help shape what came to be known as the Bennington Triangle, a region whose tranquility hides an inexplicable record of loss. Decades on, hikers still trace her last steps, unaware they are walking the route that changed a state. Near the trailhead, a small sign now marks the general area of her disappearance, though few stop long enough to read it. Students from Bennington College still visit on occasion, some leaving small stones or ribbons of red fabric at the base of the trees in quiet acknowledgement. The trail remains unchanged, the same slope, the same forest that absorbed her. The official case remains open, though every potential lead has long since faded into silence. The forest has reclaimed whatever it was that Paula brought into it, leaving only questions that no investigation could dislodge. For those who return from the trail, the strangest impression is not fear but recognition, a quiet sense that the woods remember the ones who never came back. Locals say that when the wind passes through the pines near Glastonbury, it moves as if retracing footsteps, a rhythm too measured to be natural. In the old case files, one investigator described the air around the trail as soundless but listening, a phrase that fits the mood of the place better than any official report. Perhaps the woods are not hostile but merely selective, opening and closing like a door that few notice until it is shut. Beyond that final bend in the trail, the silence has never been broken. The Alaska Triangle's southern edge, the mystery at Tongass Forest. At the farthest edge of the continent, where mountains collapse into a maze of islands and fog moves like a living tide, lies Tongass Forest, a place both ancient and unsettled. The air carries the scent of rain and salt, and the canopy seems to close around itself, as if guarding what lies within. For centuries, this expanse of Sitka spruce and hemlock has been more than a wilderness. It has been a boundary, a threshold where compasses falter, where trails fade into silence, and where by record and rumour alike people vanish without return. In the years following World War II, reports of disappearances within the southern reach of the Alaska Triangle began to multiply. Hunters, pilots and loggers, each confident in their craft, were said to have entered the forest under clear skies, only to dissolve into absence without a trace. Some were last seen near the coastal settlements of Ketchikan and Wrangell, others farther inland toward the Stickeen River basin, a corridor of mist and glacier runoff that splits the mountains like a wound. By the late 1950s, local papers began using the word triangle to describe this region's geography of loss, tracing invisible lines between Anchorage, Juneau and Barrow, and noting that Tongass lay squarely at its southern edge. Among the earliest missing was bush pilot Harold Leland, who vanished on June 18, 1950, while flying a small single-engine aircraft from Sitka to Prince Rupert. His radio transmission had been routine, clear skies, calm air, before cutting abruptly mid-sentence. Despite extensive search efforts involving the Civil Air Patrol and the US Coast Guard, neither wreckage nor remains were found. The terrain beneath his flight path was a labyrinth of forested fjords, ravines and valleys so deep they swallowed daylight by mid-afternoon. Investigators later remarked that radar tracking in the area had registered brief magnetic irregularities that morning, deviations they attributed to atmospheric interference, though no storms were recorded. Years later, in 1962, the case of hiker and photographer Carol McRae reignited local fears. McRae, a 29-year-old naturalist from Seattle, had been documenting old logging trails near the Unuk River, intending to capture evidence of regrowth after decades of deforestation. Her camp was found untouched, tent zipped, stove packed, camera neatly stored. The last photograph on her roll showed a mist-shrouded clearing bordered by leaning spruce, the ground dark with water and moss. No prints led away from the site, and bloodhounds, brought days later, refused to follow any scent beyond 50 yards. Rangers described the area as unnervingly still, as if the forest had drawn in its breath. The search for McRae expanded across nearly 60 square miles of rugged terrain, using helicopters, boats, and thermal imaging, yet no trace surfaced. The Tongass, larger than many nations, resisted every effort to be mapped or measured. Even satellite imaging revealed a topography distorted by cloud and moisture. The dense canopy, a living roof stretching over rivers and glacial valleys, reflected radar signals like a mirror, creating illusions of movement where there was none. Teams returning from multi-day expeditions spoke of hearing faint mechanical sounds deep within the trees, though no aircraft were present, and of compasses spinning aimlessly as though magnetism itself was uncertain. As disappearances accumulated, indigenous Tlingit and Haida oral histories began to resurface in public discussion. Elders spoke of Kushtaka, the land otter people, shapeshifters said to lure travellers from safe paths by mimicking familiar voices. While such tales were once dismissed as myth, anthropologists later noted their remarkable consistency across coastal villages separated by vast distances. The stories often described the same geography now associated with missing persons, the swamp-fed valleys and tidal channels where fog thickened without warning. To those who lived here long before written records, the forest hunger was not a metaphor but a memory. In the 1970s, as aviation expanded and tourism grew, the region's vanishing statistics became impossible to ignore. Alaska state troopers reported an average of 500 missing person cases annually, a disproportionate number occurring within the triangle's southern boundary. Most were eventually resolved, yet a small percentage, those without debris, evidence, or plausible geography, remained suspended in official archives. A 1977 report from the Federal Aviation Administration described the airspace over Tongass as electromagnetically unstable, with compass variation reaching as high as 30 degrees within short distances. Pilots called it the magnetic curtain. Scientists proposed that deposits of magnetite beneath the region's bedrock might distort navigational readings, though field measurements remained inconsistent. Attention returned to the forest interior in the 1980s, when a chain of logging accidents unsettled the region. Workers described machinery malfunctioning without cause, and radios emitting bursts of static followed by faint human-like tones. Geological teams studying the area later confirmed that portions of the terrain overlay ancient fault lines connected to the Queen Charlotte Fairweather system, among the most active seismic zones in North America. Minor tremors, invisible at the surface, could subtly shift the landscape, erasing trails or collapsing soft earth without visible evidence. Yet even these explanations failed to satisfy those who had seen men vanish in plain view. One of the most unsettling cases occurred in 1986, when two experienced forestry researchers, Daniel Karp and Evelyn Ross, disappeared near the Chickamin River during a routine soil survey. Their GPS tracker transmitted erratic coordinates before ceasing altogether. When searchers reached the site, they found the team's sample bags neatly arranged beside a notepad, its final line reading only, "The ground sounds hollow here." Weeks of excavation revealed no voids or caverns, only layers of saturated loam and root systems that twisted like veins. The case remains open, though local records list it simply as environmental disappearance. At present, Tonga stands as both a biological wonder and a ledger of unanswered questions. Stretching across 16.7 million acres, it remains the largest intact temperate rainforest on Earth, a place where ecosystems merge in perpetual motion. Fog from the Pacific rolls in daily, feeding mosses that climb the trunks of thousand-year-old cedars. Beneath the canopy, entire rivers run unseen, carving paths through soil that has never known full sunlight. For many, this is the forest's true mystery, not a single disappearance or legend, but the way it resists the finality of human explanation. To those who enter, it offers beauty and silence in equal measure, and sometimes nothing more. Deep within that endless canopy, the forest keeps the stories it chooses never to return. The Vanishing Hunters of Bitterroot Range. When the hunter fired into the cold morning air, the mountain gave no echo in return. The report of the rifle should have bounced off the timbered slopes and jagged ridges, yet nothing returned to confirm the shot's passage. In its place there was only a sudden, unnatural stillness, as if the forest had exhaled and drawn in all sound. Snow from an earlier storm clung to the upper branches, the air crisp enough to carry even the faintest movements, yet no trace of the hunter remained beyond the neatly organised campsite he had left behind. His name was known in town, a man who'd hunted these slopes each winter without incident. Residents of Hamilton and Derby spoke of his meticulous care for both rifle and terrain, and his ability to navigate the Bitterroot's labyrinthine ridges and valleys with precision. Yet familiarity, it seemed, offered no protection. Friends described how he'd set out at first light, calling out for distant deer before vanishing into a wilderness whose topography defies even the most experienced. Maps marked trails and ridges, but in the moment of disappearance all linear understanding faltered, leaving only questions and empty air. Around him, the Bitterroot Range folds into itself until distance becomes an illusion. Deep valleys rise again as sudden ridges, while old growth stands block sight lines and distort perception. The region's conifer forests are interspersed with steep basalt cliffs and talus slopes, and the seasonal melt of alpine streams carves paths that vanish beneath dense underbrush. Such terrain is challenging even for seasoned hunters, yet the disappearances repeatedly occur in areas that should be familiar, along corridors long travelled and well documented, adding a quiet, eerie weight to the reports of loss. Early trappers recorded valleys that seemed to loop endlessly, and Salish guides warned of areas where even the most seasoned could lose their bearings. These observations date back to the 19th century, when fur trappers navigating the Bitterroot often disappeared for days or weeks, only to reappear without explanation. Journal entries describe compasses spinning unpredictably, while the echo of a voice or rifle shot would arrive delayed or distorted. Native accounts, preserved orally and later documented by anthropologists, describe forested corridors where the wind seems to bend around the mountains and shadows shift in impossible directions, creating natural illusions that confound even experienced travellers. As the search began, every path seemed to twist back upon itself. Forest rangers, local volunteers and neighbours scoured the slopes, following tracks that dissolved into mud or snow. Bloodhounds hesitated at sudden forks, and compasses wavered inexplicably on ridges where iron deposits run close to the surface. Days of aerial reconnaissance found nothing beyond the regular outlines of streams and the dark green of conifer canopy. Each returning party recounted the same sensation, that the mountains were observing, guiding, or simply indifferent, yet capable of erasing those who walked within them. One disappearance hinted at another, patterns appearing where none should exist. By the late 1960s, reports had multiplied to include both hunters and wildlife surveyors. Most were middle-aged men familiar with survival, armed with rifles and survival kits, yet their gear, when found, remained untouched. In one notable case, a hunter's tent was still pegged to the ground, his rifle leaning in its corner, boots lined neatly by the stove, as if he'd stepped away and would return, though he never did. Law enforcement files describe the region as a corridor of repeated vanishing, where tracking evidence often stops abruptly at seemingly arbitrary points along the trail. Through the forest floor runs a lattice of stone that bends more than just sound. Geologists note that the Bitterroot Mountains contain veins of magnetite and quartz capable of subtle magnetic deviations, which may distort both compass readings and electronic instruments. Beneath this, an intricate system of underground cavities and glacially carved caverns channels water and air in unpredictable ways. While such geological features are measurable, no survey accounts for the sudden cessation of trails or the absence of physical evidence in areas repeatedly scoured by search teams, leaving the intersection of science and mystery unresolved. Hydrologists note that seasonal meltwater channels vanish beneath dense forest cover, forming hidden ravines that complicate both tracking and rescue efforts. These underground and semi-subterranean waterways carve intricate networks through these mountains, some collapsing into sinkholes or sudden depressions. In addition, wildlife researchers have documented unusual magnetic readings along iron-rich ridges, occasionally disrupting GPS devices and radio equipment. While no explanation fully accounts for vanishings, these environmental quirks make survival, orientation, and evidence collection exponentially more difficult, suggesting the land itself is an active participant in the unfolding mystery. Those who make it out speak carefully, as if the air might still be listening. Returned hunters and forest guides report disorientation beyond the usual wilderness fatigue. Trails that seem familiar one moment bend unpredictably the next. Shadows shift in patterns inconsistent with sunlight and distant sounds. The snap of a branch, the drip of melting snow, appear only to vanish when investigated. Such accounts, though anecdotal, are recorded in ranger logs and local newspapers, noting how experienced individuals become as lost as newcomers, often describing the same valleys, ridges and hollows where previous disappearances occurred. Even with every ridge mapped and every trail recorded, Hunters report zones that refuse to register on instruments. GPS units fluctuate, radio signals intermittently cut out, and even modern aerial surveillance occasionally returns blank patches in the dense canopy. Satellite imagery shows the forest's vastness and complexity, yet fails to resolve the smaller corridors where hunters have disappeared. Local historians note that the pattern stretches over decades, suggesting a persistent if inexplicable property of the land. The range itself, while beautiful and bountiful, has become synonymous with absence, a living ledger of unanswered questions that no technology has yet deciphered. Whatever moves through those mountains does not take, it waits for those who cross its silence. The Phantom Camp of Mount Rainier. The tents sat undisturbed on the glacier's edge, as if the campers had simply stepped away and never returned. Each canvas flap remained tightly fastened against the wind, the campfire cold yet perfectly arranged, and no footprints led away beyond the immediate snow. Supplies were stacked neatly beside the shelters, including food tins and climbing ropes, untouched despite days passing in the relentless mountain cold. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional murmur of distant icefalls, and yet there was no hint of human presence anywhere. Each of the three men was experienced, known in the climbing community for precision and caution, yet none returned from their ascent. Mount Rainier has long attracted skilled climbers familiar with crevasse rescue, avalanche assessment, and glacial navigation, yet these men vanished as if swallowed by the mountain itself. Friends reported that they had completed dozens of climbs in the Cascades, carrying equipment designed to withstand both storm and ice, and yet all preparation counted for nothing against the unseen forces that claimed them. Their names are recorded in climbing logs and park archives, a factual record contrasting sharply with the inexplicable emptiness left behind. Along familiar trails in the early 1900s, hikers and guides disappeared, leaving behind only untouched campsites. Between 1905 and 1935, several documented expeditions ended with tents and supplies intact, but the occupants vanished without a trace. Park logs note that these early climbers, many with extensive wilderness experience, often disappeared during clear weather and mild conditions, baffling rangers and locals alike. Letters from guides describe compasses spinning erratically on ridgelines and snowfall that appeared localized, as if the mountain itself rewrote the terrain. Such historical incidents provide a troubling context for modern climbers, suggesting that Mount Rainier has long exerted a silent, inexplicable influence over those who traverse its glaciers. Rescue teams traced footprints that stopped abruptly at the edge of the camp, as though the climbers had vanished into thin air. Snowshoes, crampons, and tracks in the compacted snow provided no clues beyond a few meters, and even the strongest scent lines for trained dogs evaporated in the cold, thin air. Helicopter searches found only glacial expanse and rock outcrops, the terrain folding back on itself in ways that confounded orientation. In journals filed with Mount Rainier National Park, rangers noted a disquieting consistency. The missing were last seen near intact camps, and the natural evidence suggested neither struggle nor accident. Even on calm mornings, the mountain can create walls of wind and sudden fog that erase sound and sense of direction. Mount Rainier's glaciers generate microclimates that fluctuate in minutes, creating pockets of dense fog, sudden gusts, and whispering winds along crevasse edges. Storms can arrive with no warning, and the mountain snowfields shift beneath a climber's weight, hiding cracks and weak ice under deceptively solid surfaces. Yet these vanished climbers disappeared during clear conditions, making the environmental hazards seem almost irrelevant, as if the mountain conspired through something more subtle than physical peril. The ice axe rested against a boulder, its edge free of snow, betraying no hint of the climber's next move. Tents contained sleeping bags folded as if ready for evening use, stoves cold but clean, and water bottles uncapped yet untouched. Not a single item appeared disturbed, and yet the occupants were nowhere to be found. Such meticulous abandonment has been documented in other incidents in the park, producing a pattern of disappearance in which human presence vanishes while human preparation remains pristine, a forensic puzzle that leaves searchers questioning the very nature of the mountain. This was not the first time a camp had been found abandoned, yet the precision of absence repeated across decades. In 1929, climbers reported a tent at Camp Muir appearing fully occupied but empty upon approach, their companions never returning. Later, in 1952, a party of 3 vanished near Liberty Ridge under similar conditions, leaving boots and backpacks in orderly rows. The historical record, maintained in park files and climbing journals, documents a chilling recurrence, suggesting that Mount Rainier, with its glaciers and ice fields, has a peculiar relationship with those who enter and never leave, indifferent to experience or skill. Glaciologists have documented hidden ice caves and sudden seracs that form and collapse without warning, creating natural voids beneath the surface. These features, sometimes only a few meters across, can swallow small sections of trail or destabilize snowfields in ways invisible from above. In addition, reports indicate unusual acoustic anomalies near crevasse fields, where voices or footsteps are muffled or echoed unpredictably, confusing even experienced climbers. While no scientific explanation fully accounts for disappearances, these characteristics of the glacier environment suggest that the mountain's complex and shifting structure contributes to the uncanny precision with which people vanish, leaving only undisturbed equipment as testimony. Sensors placed on the glacier noted intermittent magnetic deviations and sudden microbursts of wind that defy local weather reports. Park researchers studying glacial movement also documented anomalous electromagnetic readings, likely caused by iron-rich strata beneath the surface, which could influence compasses and radio transmissions. In addition, small avalanches or ice calvings occasionally occur with no warning, yet these vanished climbers left no evidence of being swept away. Such environmental factors may partially explain navigational errors, but they fail to account for the absence of even the smallest traces, boots, gloves, or ropes, outside the carefully maintained campsites. Guides continue to recount the phantom camp to newcomers, warning that Mount Rainier's ice remembers who has passed and who has not returned. Modern climbers are briefed on these incidents before attempting high routes, and even seasoned guides speak of the area with reverent caution. Satellite maps and GPS units provide precise elevation and slope data, yet climbers report strange phenomena: sounds muted across valleys, footprints that appear and disappear, and a chilling stillness where human activity should leave echoes. In the minds of those who traverse the glaciers, the mountain is no longer just a physical challenge, it is a presence, a silent observer of who remains and who is claimed by its vast frozen expanse. Amid the shifting ice and silent ridges, the mountain keeps its absence in perfect order. The Ozark National Forest Incident, the man who walked into the trees. The first light of autumn crept across the Ozark National Forest in northern Arkansas, casting long, fractured shadows between the trunks of oak and hickory. In 1989, the forest stretched in quiet expanses, punctuated only by the occasional thrum of distant traffic along Highway 7. The air carried a damp chill that seeped through layers of clothing and lingered under the heavy canopy. Among the scattered glades and rocky hollows, a man named Samuel Hayes, a photographer known for his meticulous nature, began his early morning trek, his camera slung across his shoulder. That morning, however, his steps into the forest marked the last time anyone would see him. Hayes had lived in Little Rock but travelled frequently to remote regions for his work, often alone. His photographs were sought after for magazines and exhibitions, praised for their ability to capture both grandeur and the intimate textures of nature. Friends described him as cautious, always leaving detailed itineraries and emergency contact information. On the day of his disappearance, he carried a standard kit: a Nikon F3, assorted lenses, a tripod, a field notebook, and enough provisions for 2 days. Days later, a search party found his camera, perched on a low bough as if set down in passing, still running, its film exposed to a series of blank, wind-stirred frames. The Ozark National Forest spans over 1 million acres, a labyrinth of rugged hills, sandstone bluffs, and glades covered with oak, hickory, and pine. The area Hayes entered was notoriously difficult to navigate, with intermittent creeks cutting into valleys and cliffs that appeared suddenly after gentle rises. Rangers and local hunters often spoke of these woods as a place where even experienced outdoorsmen could lose their bearings. Magnetic anomalies in certain sections attributed to the high iron content in the region's sandstone formations were known to disrupt compasses and radios. The recovery of his camera introduced questions no one could answer. Set on a low branch, it still ran, the film partially exposed, capturing the movement of wind and leaves, but not Hayes himself. The positioning suggested deliberate placement rather than accident. The strap was carefully looped over the branch, and there was no sign of a struggle nearby. Investigators considered the possibility of environmental interference, flash flooding, sudden drop-offs, or animal activity, yet none could account for the absence of a body or clothing, the disappearance of boots, or the lack of any blood or personal items typically left behind in wilderness accidents. The forest seemed, in those early days, to have swallowed him completely. Local folklore, often dismissed by authorities, surfaced in the aftermath. Residents of nearby Jasper and Harrison recounted tales of travellers becoming disoriented in the mist-heavy hollows, reporting eerie sensations of being watched or followed. The vanishing trails, as some called them, were stretches where even experienced hunters claimed compasses spun wildly and footsteps echoed in unnatural patterns. The Ozarks, geologists noted, contain one of the oldest exposures of Paleozoic rock in the central United States, producing caverns, sinkholes, and subterranean channels that have yet to be fully mapped. Ranger logs from the time of Hayes' disappearance note that the weather was unusually stable for early October, with temperatures hovering around 50 degrees Fahrenheit and morning mist lingering in the valleys. This further complicated explanations involving environmental hazards. The psychological impact on the search teams was documented in journals and police reports. Volunteers reported feelings of vertigo, disorientation, and the unsettling sense that the forest itself had shifted overnight, erasing paths they had carefully memorized. Investigators examined his recent photographs for clues. The frames preceding the camera's final resting place depicted ordinary forest scenes: a glint of sun on wet leaves, a cluster of mushrooms along a creek bed, a squirrel frozen mid-leap. Nothing indicated panic, distress, or the presence of another person. Yet the camera's position, away from any visible path, suggested that Hayes had moved deliberately deeper into the forest, possibly towards some unseen destination. Witnesses in nearby towns reported faint glimpses of a man matching his description along the forest edge in the days after his disappearance, always walking alone, often in areas already scoured by search teams. None of these sightings could be verified, and no photographs or physical evidence emerged to support them. Over the years, the case drew the attention of writers and investigators fascinated by unexplained disappearances. Comparisons were made to other vanishing incidents across the United States, particularly those involving dense forests, high plateau regions, or geomagnetic anomalies. While some theorists suggested abduction or foul play, the absence of crime scene indicators or signs of struggle left the forest itself as the most consistent variable. Studies of the Ozarks' topography revealed countless hidden hollows and steep ravines that could conceal a person, yet exhaustive searches and aerial surveys over decades failed to locate Hayes or any trace of him beyond the camera. His name remained on missing person lists, a testament to both human curiosity and the enduring mystery of the terrain. As years passed, the memory of Samuel Hayes became intertwined with the forest he'd sought to capture. Photographers continued to wander the trails he once walked, noting the subtle changes in light and the patterns of mist through the glades. Rangers occasionally reported cameras found abandoned in unusual positions, though none were traced back to known owners. The forest's atmosphere remained charged with quiet tension, a place where paths folded into themselves and where the ordinary rhythms of wildlife and wind could mask the presence, or absence, of a single man. The Ozark National Forest, ancient and unyielding, held its secrets with patient indifference, leaving those who entered to wonder whether some vanishings were accidents, some deliberate, and some beyond understanding. No one ever saw Samuel Hayes step out of the trees again. The vanishing of Charles McCullough, the snow prints that stopped. Winter descended over Crater Lake with a quiet insistence, blanketing the caldera in near impenetrable white. The lake itself, formed in the caldera of the collapsed Mount Mazama more than 7,700 years ago, lay hidden beneath a frozen sheet, its depths invisible and silent. The surrounding cliffs rose sharply, sheer walls of volcanic rock dusted with snow that could shift from firm ice to powder in moments, creating treacherous footing for even the most experienced hiker. In early February of 1991, the region was renowned for its unpredictable weather, with sudden snow squalls and temperatures plummeting below zero, conditions that could isolate any traveller within minutes. On one of these frigid mornings, Charles McCullough, a 24-year-old amateur photographer from Oregon, set out to capture the lake's austere winter beauty, unaware that his journey would become one of the most perplexing disappearances in the area's history. McCullough had travelled alone, guided by both maps and instinct, carrying equipment that would capture the lake's frozen landscapes in stark detail. Known among friends for his patience and methodical approach, he had planned his route along the western rim of the caldera, where steep slopes gave way to ridges and hidden glacial pockets. Prior trips had earned him recognition for photographing wildlife tracks and the delicate frost formations on dormant shrubs, yet winter on Crater Lake was an unforgiving teacher. Trails vanished under snowdrifts, and landmarks shifted with each storm. Still, McCullough pressed onward, leaving faint footprints that would later confound search teamers with their abrupt disappearance. Days later, a ranger following a cleared trail stumbled upon prints that stopped abruptly in fresh snow, as if he'd vanished into the wind itself. The tracks, measured and deliberate, indicated a cautious progression, not the hurried or chaotic flight typical of someone lost or panicked. They ended in an area of shallow depression near a ridge overlook, where the snow was undisturbed beyond the final prints. Despite extensive searches that followed, no sign of McCullough's body, clothing or equipment was found beyond this point. The abrupt termination of the tracks led investigators to consider several hypotheses: sudden injury, animal interference, or environmental anomaly. Yet the absence of blood or drag marks, combined with the meticulous spacing of the footprints, made conventional explanations increasingly difficult to accept. When the snow receded in early spring, the remnants of McCullough's trek emerged, suspended between memory and reality. His camera bag and a set of keys were discovered partially buried at the edge of a snowmelt pool near the lake's rim, seemingly abandoned without explanation. Sub-zero conditions had preserved the items remarkably well, yet there were no fingerprints or indications of struggle. Rangers documented these details meticulously, noting that the items' positions did not correspond to a fall or tumble, suggesting intentional placement rather than accident. The lake, deep and unyielding, retained no further traces, leaving the mystery suspended in a landscape that was both beautiful and indifferent. Crater Lake's sheer cliffs and sudden snow squalls transformed familiar paths into unpredictable traps, concealing both life and evidence. The caldera, one of the deepest in North America at over 1,900 feet, presents steep volcanic walls that funnel wind and snow in ways that can disorient even experienced hikers. Local meteorological data from the National Weather Service confirm that temperatures during McCullough's disappearance had fluctuated dramatically overnight, with high winds creating snowdrifts that could cover tracks within hours. Rescue teams relied on avalanche transceivers, satellite radios, and trained search dogs, yet the dogs often faltered in the deep wind-packed snow where scents were diffused or erased. Visitors and rangers recalled fleeting shadows on ridges or the echo of footsteps where none should have been, tales quietly preserved in lodge journals and ranger logs. Some described noticing a figure moving along the ridgeline during storms, glimpsed through sheets of falling snow, but visibility was often under 20 meters, and no photograph or corroborating evidence ever surfaced. These reports, though anecdotal, underscored the sense of disorientation that gripped the caldera during winter months. In this environment, McCullough's disappearance became more than a case of lost hikers. It became a story of nature's capacity to erase presence. Teams combed the frozen landscape with meticulous care, yet every route seemed to dissolve beneath the snow, leaving only questions in its wake. Search patterns extended for miles along ridges and gullies, incorporating both aerial reconnaissance and ground sweeps, yet no further artifacts were discovered. Each morning, footprints left by search teams were erased by drifting snow, the wind smoothing the surface to an unbroken sheet of white. Helicopters scoured the caldera from above, noting the dramatic contrast between dark water and snow-covered rims, but the sheer depth of the lake itself offered no clues. Even experienced mountaineers spoke of a peculiar hush, as though the caldera itself exhaled silence in the presence of absence. The lake's stillness, coupled with snow that absorbed sound, created an uncanny quiet that amplified the sensation of isolation. Photographs taken in later expeditions captured nothing more than frozen cliffs, thin clouds, and occasional wildlife tracks, yet the memory of McCullough's vanished prints haunted every survey. Over time, the lake came to symbolize both natural grandeur and imperceptible danger, a place where human presence could be reduced to a single trace of footprints, later erased without explanation. Scholars of Crater Lake's geology noted that subsurface voids and ancient lava tubes existed in some sections, though none aligned with the area of disappearance, offering speculation without resolution. The prints, the keys, the abandoned bag, each a fragment of a story that the lake refused to complete. While McCullough's friends and family sought closure, the caldera held its secrets with patient indifference. Each year, as winter returned, hikers and photographers retraced the same routes, aware of the lake's capacity to absorb human presence. Every snowstorm obliterated the trails, restoring the landscape to its pristine, enigmatic state, where even meticulous documentation could not predict what might be revealed or concealed. In this way, Charles McCullough's vanishing endured not only as a factual event, but as a testament to the unpredictability and quiet menace of one of America's most isolated winter landscapes. The snow held its quiet, and McCullough's fate remained unreadable to all who came after. The Canyonlands mystery, the hiker who left no shadow. The image was ordinary at first glance, a sunlit canyon wall streaked with red and ochre, until a figure appeared watching him from the cliffs. The photograph, recovered from Jonathan Merrick's camera after a routine inspection by park rangers, captured a presence that seemed impossibly placed. The figure's stance was calm, almost indifferent, yet the ledge it occupied was inaccessible by known trails or climbing routes, a rocky perch that even experienced climbers would have approached with extreme caution. The camera itself was a Nikon F4, loaded with high-resolution film, and the frame was sharp enough to reveal details of Merrick's own backpack, juxtaposed against the impossibility of the observer's location. This single photograph became the first and only clue to the hiker's disappearance, and it was enough to unsettle anyone familiar with Utah's Canyonlands. Jonathan Merrick had planned the expedition for months, his backpack filled with gear for a multi-day trek across Utah's most remote sandstone plateaus. At 27, he was an experienced solo hiker and amateur photographer, familiar with the hazards of desert canyons, sudden flash floods, and temperature swings that could drop 20 degrees between day and night. He carried a GPS unit, a topographical map, emergency rations, and a first aid kit, aware that the labyrinthine trails of the Canyonlands could disorient even the most seasoned outdoorsman. His goal was to photograph the intricate patterns of erosion carved by millennia of wind and water, a landscape shaped by the Colorado and Green rivers that had rendered deep canyons, towering mesas, and isolated buttes that formed an almost alien terrain. The Canyonlands stretch endlessly, a labyrinth of red rock, narrow gullies, and sheer drop-offs that can erase even the most cautious traveller. The region covers more than 337,000 acres and is divided into distinct districts: Island in the Sky, the Needles, the Maze, each presenting unique navigational challenges. In the spring of 2004, when Merrick embarked on his trek, the desert had been unusually dry, leaving trails dusted with loose sand and gravel. Wind currents funneled through narrow canyons, shifting sand and erasing footprints in minutes, while vertical walls of Navajo sandstone created optical illusions that distorted distance and depth perception. Experts noted that certain areas, particularly in the maze, could mislead GPS signals slightly due to interference from deep canyon walls, a minor factor that may have compounded human disorientation. He ascended a narrow ridge at first light, noting the shifting shadows and photographing the way sunlight fractured across the sandstone. His camera recorded the intricate textures of the rock, the subtle gradations in colour caused by mineral deposits, and the occasional desert flora clinging to crevices. Merrick's journal entries, found later among his belongings, described the serenity of the canyons and a heightened awareness of the interplay between light and shadow, yet they ended abruptly mid-sentence, leaving an unfinished account of his final hours. Park rangers reconstructed his route from trail markers and GPS logs, confirming that he had remained on marked paths for most of the morning, only diverting briefly onto less travelled ridges where cliffs dropped sharply to canyon floors below. The figure in the image was small but unmistakable, standing in a position impossible to reach by known trails or climbing routes. Photographers and investigators noted the precision of the frame, the figure's shadow aligned with the canyon wall, yet no trace of him or any climbing gear could be discerned in the surrounding terrain. Analysis revealed no evidence of digital manipulation. The film remained untouched until it was processed, suggesting that the photograph reflected an actual moment captured in the landscape. The impossibility of the vantage point ignited a series of theories ranging from misperception to environmental anomalies, but no explanation accounted for both the figure's position and Merrick's subsequent disappearance. Rescue teams combed the canyons with infrared cameras and GPS grids, but every cliff and crevice yielded only echoes of silence. Helicopters flew low over the ridges, searching for any sign of movement or disturbed rock, while ground teams conducted line searches, meticulously scanning ledges and hidden alcoves. Canine units trained to detect human scent failed to follow any trail beyond a certain point where the canyon narrowed sharply, funneling wind that dispersed odours and erased footprints. Even experienced searchers reported a strange vertigo in these deep canyons, where horizontal lines appeared vertical and ridges seemed to float above the canyon floor, complicating efforts to determine plausible escape routes or locations. Hikers recalled the sensation of being watched, shadows that moved contrary to the sun, and whispers carried by canyon winds. Visitors in the weeks following the disappearance reported fleeting glimpses of figures standing on ledges, always out of reach and often vanishing when approached. While no eyewitness accounts could be verified, these observations were documented in park journals and ranger logs, contributing to a growing sense that the canyonlands themselves imposed a psychological weight on those who ventured deep into the maze or along isolated ridges. Geologists noted that certain sandstone formations, with their vertical striations and alcoves, could create distorted shadows and echoes, reinforcing the perception of presence where none existed. The sandstone cliffs, shaped over millions of years by wind and water, create hidden ledges and optical illusions that challenge depth perception. In some areas, natural alcoves extend several feet into the rock, concealing vantage points invisible from lower ground, while eroded rock formations cast shadows that shift dramatically with the sun's position. Microclimates form within narrow canyons, where temperatures can differ significantly from adjacent plateaus, producing localized wind currents that carry sound unpredictably. These physical realities were confirmed in later surveys and simulations, yet none explained the precise alignment of the figure in Merrick's photograph or the absence of his tracks beyond a certain point. Despite exhaustive mapping and repeated searches, Merrick's final steps could only be inferred, each theory as fragile as the cliffs themselves. Experts compared his case to other disappearances in remote desert canyons, where environmental hazards, disorientation, and sudden isolation often left only faint traces. Yet Merrick's experience was distinguished by the photographic evidence and the complete absence of physical remains, creating a scenario that defied conventional wilderness accident explanations. Over time, the Canyonlands became a symbol of both natural grandeur and impenetrable mystery, a place where human presence could be reduced to a single inexplicable moment frozen in a photograph. He disappeared into the labyrinth of stone and the earth made no sign of him. The White Mountains Mystery, the Lost Campers of Franconia Notch. Twilight deepened over Franconia Notch when the wind carried a sound that none of the campers recognised. It was faint at first, a rustling among the birch and spruce that did not match the flow of the Pemigewasset River or the whisper of distant cliffs. The friends paused mid-conversation, exchanging uncertain glances, aware that the Notch's narrow corridor, carved by glaciers thousands of years ago, could bend sound in ways that made distance and direction deceptive. The forest here, part of the White Mountains National Forest in New Hampshire, was dense with mixed hardwoods and evergreens, where undergrowth could swallow a person's footsteps in seconds. The sense of quiet unease settled over the group, a subtle prelude to the inexplicable events that would follow. 5 friends, seasoned hikers all, had set out to explore the Notch's winding trails, confident in their maps and equipment. Ranging in age from 22 to 28, they carried lightweight tents, synthetic sleeping bags, and backpacks stocked with provisions for 2 nights. They had researched the area carefully, noting that Franconia Notch, a narrow pass flanked by steep granite cliffs and known for its glacially carved valleys, could be deceptively easy to navigate in daylight, but treacherous once shadows deepened. While they joked about the tales of hikers lost along the notch, they remained mindful of the region's variable weather. Summer thunderstorms could roll in suddenly, and late evening temperatures often dropped 10 degrees within the space of an hour, conditions that could catch even the prepared off guard. The notch, carved by glacial forces, narrows abruptly between sheer granite walls and dense spruce forests, a corridor where sound and light behave unpredictably. Rivers and streams, fed by snowmelt from Mount Lafayette and Cannon Mountain, wound through the valley floor, their currents often louder than the human voice and yet capable of masking subtle movements. Trails, though well maintained, passed beneath overhanging ledges and through pockets of thick undergrowth, creating natural blind spots where a hiker might be momentarily invisible. In summer, moss and ferns thrived along shaded slopes, adding both beauty and slipperiness underfoot, while in low-lying hollows fog could gather unexpectedly, shrouding the terrain in a dense, damp grey. As the fire sputtered and smoke curled toward the canopy, the friends noticed shadows stretching farther than they should, and a stillness that pressed against the crackling warmth. They spoke in quieter voices, scanning the perimeter of the clearing where they had pitched 3 tents, each assigned to 2 of the campers. Birds and insects were unusually silent, and even the rustle of leaves in the gentle wind seemed hesitant, as though the forest itself had paused. Despite their familiarity with the area, an instinctive awareness settled over them, a tension neither mapped trails nor prior experience could account for. The firelight danced on the surrounding trunks, illuminating the irregular terrain and casting angles that made familiar shapes appear strange and elongated. By morning, 3 tents were empty and the fire, still warm, offered no clue to where its occupants had gone. The remaining campers, panic mounting, called out along the narrow clearing and into the forested slopes, but no reply came, only the persistent whisper of wind and the occasional plash of the Pemigewasset River. Rangers, alerted by concerned relatives and trail reports, arrived within hours, meticulously documenting the campsite, the smouldering fire, and the surrounding forest floor. Footprints were either absent or abruptly ended at the tree line, suggesting movement that left no conventional trace. Despite sunlight illuminating the valley and the trails, search teams were immediately confronted with the notch's deceptive layout, where ravines and hidden gullies could conceal a person or scatter evidence within seconds. The surrounding forests and ledges yielded to the rangers' meticulous search, yet the path of the missing dissolved among trees and rocks. Canine units were deployed, but the scent often faltered amid the combination of damp undergrowth and the convergence of multiple human scents. Helicopters conducted aerial reconnaissance, noting that from above, the terrain's intricate folds created patterns of shadow that could easily obscure movement. The New Hampshire Fish and Game Department, referencing historical records, noted that similar disappearances in the White Mountains often involved hikers vanishing along narrow valleys or near streambeds, where even experienced searchers found footing precarious and visibility limited. The forest floor bore unnatural impressions, moss flattened in intricate shapes, and fog lingered in hollows far longer than usual for late summer. Rangers observed that some depressions in the moss were circular and measured precisely around the size of a human body, though no bodies were ever recovered. Lichen and ferns growing nearby appeared untouched, as if the area had not been traversed. Local meteorological data confirmed that overnight temperatures had dropped sharply, creating dew that settled heavily on undergrowth and leaves, preserving impressions while simultaneously erasing lighter tracks. The combination of vegetation patterns, fog persistence, and sudden temperature drops created a microenvironment that both preserved and concealed evidence in equal measure. Park archives over decades tell of campers who vanished, their belongings and fires left exactly as they had been. In some cases, rangers noted that trail markers appeared unchanged, as though the missing had walked through invisible paths. Historical accounts from the 1950s and 1960s detailed hikers disappearing along Franconia Notch under circumstances equally baffling, often leaving behind personal items or meals, prepared but never consumed. While no paranormal claims were substantiated, the pattern of vanishings contributed to a cautious respect among frequent visitors and a sense that the notch could quietly defy conventional explanation. Repeated searches revealed nothing. The notch kept its secret, leaving only empty tents and a lingering fire. Rescue teams documented every ridge, ravine and tributary along the Pemigewasset, yet the missing remained unaccounted for. The combination of dense forest, steep terrain, and narrow glacial valleys created an environment in which human presence could disappear almost instantly, leaving only indirect signs. Over time, the case became a point of study for wilderness safety experts, psychologists, and park historians alike, highlighting the uncanny capacity of certain landscapes to absorb human activity without leaving a trace. The friend's disappearance remained unresolved, an enigma preserved by both geography and time. The fire burned low, and the forest kept its silence as if the campers had never existed. The disappearance at Lake Mead, the vanished couple of 1962. On a sun-drenched morning in early June, Harold and Marjorie Winslow launched their small boat from a quiet cove along Lake Mead's eastern shoreline. The water glimmered like molten glass under the desert sun, stretching outward into deep blue expanses flanked by sandstone cliffs and jagged outcroppings. Their departure seemed ordinary, a weekend excursion into a lake that had transformed a once arid canyon into one of the largest reservoirs in the United States. At the time, Lake Mead was only 2 decades old. Formed after the construction of the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River in the 1930s, a man-made marvel that both fascinated and intimidated local boaters with its vastness and unpredictable currents. The Winslows, both in their early 30s, were experienced swimmers and casual sailors, familiar with the sprawling waters that stretched along the Nevada-Arizona border. They had packed lightly, a small cooler, 2 life jackets, oars, and a basic marine radio reflecting both the era and their confidence in their abilities. Friends described them as cautious and methodical, careful to note landmarks along the shoreline and aware of the lake's hidden hazards, which included submerged rocks, sudden drop-offs, and the occasional turbulent wave created by passing motorboats or shifting winds. The couple's intent was leisurely, to explore a secluded inlet favoured by anglers and photographers seeking the lake's scenic cliffs, now partially submerged by rising water levels following an unusually wet spring. Lake Mead, formed by the Hoover Dam, covered over 247 square miles of desert basin, its waters rising and falling with seasonal runoff and the whims of the Colorado River. Depths reached over 500 feet in certain areas, and submerged canyons and former riverbeds created a labyrinthine underwater topography invisible from the surface. Winds funneled unpredictably through canyon corridors, sometimes creating gusts that could throw small craft off course, while the intense sun reflected off the water, producing optical illusions that disoriented even experienced boaters. Boating safety regulations in 1962 were minimal compared with modern standards. Life jackets were required but not always worn, and there were no electronic depth finders or GPS navigation systems to assist travellers in the expansive reservoir. They navigated toward a narrow inlet, the sun glaring off the surface while the desert wind sculpted small waves that rippled beneath their hull. The couple's conversation was light, punctuated by laughter and the occasional call to one another over the lap of water against the boat's sides. The inlet narrowed quickly, flanked by cliffs that had once been desert ridges now partially submerged, creating pockets of shadow and areas of shallow water hidden beneath gentle ripples. Birds wheeled overhead, casting fleeting shadows on the water, and a few hardy fish broke the surface near rocky ledges, glimpses of life in a landscape both inviting and unforgiving. Hours later, another visitor to the cove discovered the Winslow's boat adrift, the oars neatly in place and the engine still warm, yet the couple was nowhere in sight. The small vessel rocked gently with the current, tied only by a single rope to a partially submerged tree trunk. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned equipment, and the radio lay quietly in its compartment. Rangers and local authorities were called immediately, noting the peculiarity of the boat's condition. Everything suggested the occupants had simply vanished, leaving behind a scene untouched since the morning departure. Authorities deployed small boats and helicopters, combing the azure expanse and shadowed coves, yet each sweep returned empty, the water concealing all trace of the missing. Sonar equipment was employed where depth allowed, scanning the lakebed for signs of wreckage or obstruction. But even decades later, the Winslow's fate remains unresolved. Rangers interviewed witnesses, including fishermen and hikers along nearby ridges, and combed every accessible shoreline, yet no footprints, swimming tracks or drift patterns could explain their disappearance. The scale of the lake, combined with submerged canyons and fluctuating water levels, complicated the search, turning a straightforward rescue into a baffling investigation that seemed to defy logic. The lake's surface could change within minutes. Sudden gusts funneled between canyon walls and water levels revealed jagged rocks that had once been dry shore. Summer winds in the Mojave Desert region could whip across the water at surprising speeds, creating waves and eddies that disoriented small craft. Temperature fluctuations were extreme, with surface water warmed by direct sunlight, while depths remained icy cold, a factor that could both preserve and obscure evidence. Historical meteorological records confirm that on the day of the disappearance, the area experienced steady sun with intermittent gusts exceeding 20 miles per hour, conditions capable of confusing even skilled sailors and contributing to the lake's reputation as deceptively calm. Veteran boaters recalled tales of travelers vanishing into quiet inlets, their boats later found undisturbed, a pattern noted in ranger logs dating back to the reservoir's opening. Some incidents involved small craft drifting out of view, with occupants never seen again, while in other cases, the lake's shifting shoreline and sudden drop-offs concealed remains or wreckage indefinitely. Local law emphasized both the beauty and the peril of Lake Mead, cautioning visitors to respect its scale and unpredictable conditions. These stories, while anecdotal, reinforced the impression that the lake had a capacity to absorb human presence, leaving only the smallest hints of passage behind. Decades later, the Winslow's disappearance remains a case study in how a vast and shifting body of water can erase those who venture upon it, leaving only the faintest ripple of memory. Scholars and investigators have examined the incident repeatedly, considering environmental factors, potential accidents, and even rare hydrological phenomena such as sudden whirlpools or localized currents caused by submerged canyon channels. Yet the absence of physical evidence, combined with the lake's sheer size and the era's limited tracking technology, has ensured that the mystery persists. The story of Harold and Marjorie Winslow endures, a reminder of how even ordinary excursions into familiar landscapes can dissolve into the inexplicable. The lake swallowed them entirely, and even the sun's glare could not reveal what lay beneath its surface. The Man Who Vanished Twice, the curious case of Aaron Hedges. In the shadow of the crazy mountains, Aaron Hedges set out for a solo trek that would vanish into local legend. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of alpine firs and the faint musk of early summer wildflowers, while the jagged peaks of Sweetgrass County rose abruptly from the surrounding plains. Hedges, an experienced outdoorsman, had planned a route that would take him through dense pine groves, across narrow ridges, and into the steep coulees that gave the range its name. Few travellers dared to explore the less-travelled trails here, where sudden storms and erratic winds could change the landscape in an instant, and where the rugged topography often concealed even the most careful movements. At 34, Hedges was a seasoned climber familiar with the granite ridges and hidden valleys of the crazy mountains, well versed in the subtle dangers of high-altitude terrain. His experience included solo expeditions lasting days, during which he relied on topographic maps, a compass, and minimal supplies, confident in his ability to navigate difficult terrain. Friends described him as meticulous, often studying the weather and terrain before attempting routes that other hikers avoided. Yet even with his preparation, the mountains held an unpredictable power, their cliffs and shadowed forests capable of swallowing a person without leaving a trace. The range rises sharply from the plains, a series of jagged peaks surrounded by alpine forests, where sudden storms and erratic winds are known to disorient even experienced travelers. The crazy mountains, part of Montana's Lewis and Clark National Forest, are isolated, rising nearly 7,000 feet above the surrounding valleys, with dense forests that give way to exposed rock faces near the summits. Glacial activity during the Pleistocene epoch carved deep ravines and cirques, creating natural funnels that can amplify wind and channel sound in strange ways. Hikers often report sudden temperature drops and shifting visibility, and snowfields can linger well into July, forming hidden patches that obscure trails and complicate navigation. Search teams and volunteers scoured ridges and riverbeds, yet each sweep yielded only echoes of his passage and the faintest impressions of a trail abruptly ending in open rock. Parties combed the region systematically, marking every ledge and canyon floor, yet no definitive sign of hedges appeared. Aerial reconnaissance revealed nothing beyond the jagged contours and shadowed gullies, and local wildlife offered no clues, leaving investigators with only the sense that the mountains themselves had absorbed him. Maps and reports from previous searches confirmed the extreme difficulty of moving unnoticed across the ridges, emphasizing that a person could vanish in moments, leaving no recoverable trace. Several years after his disappearance, hikers stumbled upon skeletal remains miles from where he had first vanished, in a ravine separated by ridges impossible to traverse unnoticed. The remains were partially concealed by rock overhangs and fallen trees, suggesting minimal disturbance from animals or weather. Geologists noted that the terrain between the original campsite and discovery site was marked by sheer cliffs and steep scree slopes, with no natural paths for safe passage. The discovery sparked renewed investigation, yet forensic analysis indicated that Hedges' remains could not have been moved naturally from his last known location, and the estimated time of death correlated closely with his original disappearance. Forensic investigators noted that the skeletal position and surrounding terrain suggested no feasible route between the original campsite and the discovery site, confounding conventional logic. The bones showed no signs of trauma consistent with accident or attack, and environmental conditions preserved evidence of a stationary presence at the discovery site. Experts examined soil layers and vegetation growth, confirming that the area had remained largely untouched since the remains were deposited. Local authorities and wilderness experts were left with an unsolvable anomaly, a body found in a location separated by ridges and obstacles that, according to mapping and topographic analysis, could not have been crossed without detection or physical evidence. Locals whispered of the vanishing peaks, citing instances of hikers who never returned even with extensive searches, a pattern stretching back generations. Historical accounts documented disappearances dating to the early 20th century, including hunters, shepherds, and prospectors who had ventured into the range and were never seen again. These stories, sometimes dismissed as folklore, acquired an eerie weight when combined with Hedges' inexplicable second disappearance. The region's reputation for unpredictability grew, and visitors were warned to travel in groups, carry emergency signalling devices, and respect the mountain's hidden complexities, though few could account for the phenomena that had removed Hedges from sight twice. Family members recalled the unsettling certainty that he had been lost forever, and yet the discovery rekindled questions that none could answer. The initial disappearance had left grief and confusion, but the emergence of his remains in an inaccessible ravine challenged both rational explanation and the memory of the people who had searched tirelessly for years. Psychological experts noted the peculiar tension between closure and renewed uncertainty, emphasizing how the human mind struggles to reconcile evidence that defies logical understanding. Hedges' case became a focal point in studies of wilderness disappearance, highlighting how even experienced individuals could be claimed by the environment in ways that confounded science and intuition alike. Meticulous mapping and repeated expeditions could not pierce the crazy mountain's secret, leaving Hedges' dual disappearance as a testament to the wilderness's capacity for erasing its visitors. Modern search techniques, including GPS tracking, aerial drones, and infrared surveillance, confirmed the area's complexity, yet no technology could illuminate why or how Hedges had disappeared twice, nor why he reappeared in a location physically impossible to reconcile with his first vanishing. The mountains, with their combination of steep escarpments, hidden gullies, and variable weather, remained an enduring enigma, capable of absorbing those who entered and leaving only incomplete records of passage. He vanished twice, yet the mountains seemed to remember only one of his footsteps. The Olympic National Park disappearances, the moss and the mist. Mist clung to the branches of towering western hemlocks, settling over moss-carpeted ground and shrouding the narrow trail in near-perpetual twilight. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy, and the air carried the persistent scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the faint tang of resin from ancient conifers. Every step pressed into spongy moss that blanketed rocks and roots, muting movement and muffling sound. The Olympic temperate rainforest is one of the most diverse in the continental United States, covering over 950,000 acres in the Olympic Peninsula of Washington, where rainfall exceeds 140 inches annually, creating an environment both beautiful and treacherously disorienting for those who enter unprepared. Official logs from the 1970s note a string of hikers who entered the Hoh Valley and were never seen again, their packs later discovered abandoned along meandering creek beds. Many of these early reports were dismissed as accidents or misadventures until patterns emerged: footprints halting abruptly, tents left untouched, and personal items scattered in ways inconsistent with normal hiking mishaps. One case involved a young botanist whose field journal, filled with detailed sketches of lichens and moss, was found leaning against a tree as if she'd stepped away momentarily, yet she never returned. Such records hinted at a forest that could conceal its visitors with a precision that defied explanation, challenging both rangers and scientists to account for the anomalies. The Olympic rainforest receives over 140 inches of rain annually, fostering dense undergrowth, thick moss, and an intricate network of streams that can mislead even experienced hikers. Rivers and rivulets meander through valleys, often disappearing beneath fallen logs or into shallow subterranean channels. Trails marked decades ago can vanish beneath seasonal vegetation growth, and the underbrush can obscure sheer drops or hidden pools of water. Temperature variations between valley floors and higher elevations create microclimates, producing persistent fog patches that linger for hours or days, reducing visibility to mere feet. These conditions make navigation a formidable challenge, as even the most skilled hikers can misjudge distance and direction when trails shift beneath an ever-changing canopy. Forest wardens patrolling the Quinault Basin recounted moments when compasses spun erratically, and trails seemed to shift beneath their feet as if the forest itself were rearranging. One veteran warden described a morning when a mist rolled down the valley so thick that familiar landmarks disappeared, leaving only the sound of dripping water and rustling leaves. Attempts to follow tracks were confounded by moss-covered surfaces that concealed impressions or caused them to fade within hours. Reports of disorientation were frequent. Hikers and wardens alike experienced sudden vertigo, an eerie sense that the trail behind them had ceased to exist, and the faint echo of footsteps that never matched their own. Field experts noted that many vanishings occurred along river valleys where mist lingered longest, and footprints often ended abruptly at moss-covered slopes. Patterns suggested that the disappearances were not random but concentrated in areas where topography, fog, and dense vegetation intersected. Investigators documented instances where small groups of hikers became separated from one another without warning, only to re-emerge hours later at points that contradicted the known geography. Seasonal variations played a role. The heaviest rainfall coincided with some of the most perplexing vanishings, as swollen streams and hidden pools altered familiar paths and made conventional navigation nearly impossible. Helicopters hovered over the canopy, while ground teams navigated knee-deep moss and slippery roots, yet every search returned the same inexplicable emptiness. Aerial surveys revealed only the undulating terrain and the occasional glimpse of a creek glinting beneath the foliage. Ground parties discovered overturned logs, trampled ferns, and occasional footprints, but they never traced these signs to the missing individuals. Even with extensive planning, search operations were hampered by the forest density, rapidly changing weather, and a labyrinth of trails that few humans had traversed in their entirety. The deeper the teams ventured, the more the environment seemed to resist observation, concealing its secrets beneath a layer of wet, green quiet. Researchers studying Olympic's microclimates found that pockets of persistent fog could reduce visibility to mere feet, creating isolated zones that seemed impervious to standard tracking techniques. The combination of high humidity, dense vegetation, and irregular sun exposure produces a living maze in which light bends unpredictably and sound carries in strange directions. Stream flows fluctuate with sudden storms, erasing or obscuring tracks overnight. Even the most advanced technology of the 1970s and 1980s, from compasses to two-way radios, often failed within the rainforest's isolated valleys, complicating rescue efforts and reinforcing the notion that the forest itself could manipulate human perception. The Quinault and Hoh tribes spoke of forest spirits and places where travelers lose their way, cautionary tales that now intersect unnervingly with documented vanishings. Indigenous knowledge describes areas of the rainforest as liminal zones, where the boundaries between the human and natural worlds blur. While these accounts are often framed in mythological terms, They align with recurring patterns observed in modern reports: sudden disappearances, untraceable footsteps, and hikers appearing hours or days later at impossible locations. Anthropologists and historians note that the oral traditions of these tribes served practical purposes, warning of hazards in the rainforest that could confound the unprepared and, in some cases, claim their lives. In the moss-laden, mist-shrouded reaches of Olympic National Park, decades of monitoring have still failed to prevent visitors from disappearing, leaving only traces that vanish almost as quickly as they appear. Continuous ranger patrols, scientific surveys, and rescue operations have catalogued hundreds of unusual incidents, yet no single explanation accounts for the frequency and similarity of the disappearances. Whether the forest's labyrinthine structure, persistent microclimates, or some other anomaly is responsible, the phenomena endure, a reminder that even the most studied environments can retain elements beyond human comprehension. The rainforest preserves its secrets with a patience that outlasts generations, swallowing those who traverse its hidden corridors and leaving only the faintest echoes of their presence. Within the labyrinth of moss and mist, even the most careful footsteps can be swallowed without a sound. The Colorado Trail Enigma, the Vanished Cyclist. The Colorado Trail stretched ahead in jagged ribbons of dirt and rock, winding over alpine ridges that rose sharply above pine-strewn valleys. Above, the collegiate peaks cast long shadows across narrow switchbacks, and snow patches lingered late into the summer, concealed within gullies and shaded slopes. The trail itself is a continuous challenge, extending over 500 miles from Denver to Durango, with sections above 10,000 feet presenting hikers and bikers alike with thin air, steep ascents, and unpredictable weather. On this particular stretch, tailless fields and sudden drop-offs demanded constant attention, while the high-altitude sun and gusting winds could disorient even experienced riders within moments. Jordan Kepler, a 30-year-old endurance cyclist, had trained for months to tackle the section between Kenosha Pass and the collegiate peaks, accustomed to both steep climbs and sudden shifts in weather. He had completed previous segments of the trail at elevations exceeding 12,000 feet, carrying minimal supplies and relying on GPS navigation, a well-stocked hydration system, and high-performance mountain biking gear. Friends described him as meticulous and methodical, always double-checking his route and equipment before departures. Yet even for someone of his caliber, the Colorado Trail presented an environment that could erase progress and sense of direction with remarkable speed. At elevations above 10,000 feet, the air thinned, storms could appear without warning, and talus slopes and narrow switchbacks demanded constant attention from even the most skilled riders. Thunderclouds formed rapidly along the peaks, generating sudden gusts that could sweep a cyclist off balance. While the steep trail edges offered no margin for error, snowfields hidden beneath summer foliage could cause wheels to skid or sink unexpectedly, and loose scree shifted beneath tyres, erasing tracks within moments. Streams from melting snow created slick crossings that altered routes without warning, and the combination of altitude, exposure, and terrain complexity created an environment where disorientation could occur almost instantaneously. Mid-morning, Kepler's GPS recorded steady progress along the ridge, yet subtle shifts in the trail beneath his wheels suggested areas had eroded or shifted overnight. Video from his helmet camera captured the rhythm of pedaling over loose rock, the crunch of alpine soil, and the distant echo of mountain streams, but also a growing haze along the horizon. In certain sections, narrow ledges flanked deep drops, and the faint outlines of talus slopes appeared to move slightly in the corner of the eye, a trick of shadow and mist common in high-altitude landscapes. He stopped occasionally to record altitude and bearings, noting that portions of the trail seemed unfamiliar despite being mapped in detail, a disquieting anomaly that would only intensify later. Hours later, his tracker transmitted a final signal from a point over a sheer cliff, hundreds of feet above the nearest accessible path, baffling both search teams and technology experts. The coordinates corresponded to a steep rock face with no obvious footholds or ledges suitable for safe passage. Analysis showed that no nearby trail intersected this point, and elevation data confirmed that even a controlled descent from the nearest ridge would have been physically impossible for a cyclist carrying a full pack. Satellite and GPS specialists examined signal drift, atmospheric interference, and device error, but none could account for a precise ping emanating from a location disconnected from the established trail network. Search crews combed ridgelines and talus fields, utilising drones, satellite imagery and scent dogs, yet every sweep returned only scattered gear and undisturbed snowfields. Bicycle fragments and personal effects were found in areas of high elevation, but no footprints or additional evidence linked them conclusively to Kepler. Weather patterns complicated the searches. Sudden snow showers and heavy winds often erased tracks overnight, while dense stands of alpine fir and spruce block sightlines from both the ground and air. Teams documented microclimate zones where visibility fell below 10 feet, creating isolated sections of trail almost invisible from surrounding ridges, further confounding rescue efforts. Mapping specialists reviewed Kepler's digital trail, noting that the final coordinates corresponded to a point physically unreachable without vertical ascent or descent beyond human capability. Elevation models confirmed that the GPS ping originated from a cliff face rising more than 400 feet above the nearest traversable terrain. Attempts to reconcile the digital record with known geography led to further confusion, as no alternative route appeared feasible within the timeframe. The precision of the signal implied a stationary device at that location, rather than temporary passage, heightening the mystery and drawing scrutiny from both geospatial analysts and high-altitude cycling experts. Empty camps and overturned bikes dotted the high passes, remnants of hikers and bikers remembered by locals, forming a quiet, unsettling pattern. Historical records from the trail include instances of climbers lost during sudden storms, backpackers disappearing from marked campsites, and mountaineers never found despite exhaustive searches. While each case differed in circumstances, the clustering of unexplained disappearances at high elevations and along exposed ridges suggested an environmental pattern that eluded simple explanation. Guides and veteran riders spoke of disappearing zones, sections of trail that seemed to erase signs of human passage within hours, echoing the enigma surrounding Kepler's vanishing. Kepler's fate remained a mystery, defying precise instruments, satellite tracking, and expert knowledge of the terrain, adding yet another uncharted variable to the mountain's enduring silence. High-altitude wind shear, thermal updrafts, and sudden weather changes could all contribute to disorientation, yet none accounted for the GPS anomaly or the absence of any credible trail evidence. Scientists studying the area noted that natural phenomena, including rockfall, snowslides, and shifting scree, could erase tracks and obscure debris, but the exact combination observed in Kepler's case remained without precedent. The mountains, with their jagged peaks and narrow corridors, preserve secrets that challenge both human skill and modern technology, leaving those who traverse them vulnerable to the unknown. On the Colorado Trail, even a single pulse of data can vanish into the mountains as completely as a human footprint. The vanished children of the Sierra Nevada. The late afternoon sun fractured through the high canyon walls, sending shards of gold across the dry riverbed where children had once played. Loose stones glimmered with the last warmth of summer, and the persistent murmur of distant waterfalls threaded through this dense forest, carrying an almost tangible sense of isolation. Along these slopes, where granite cliffs met tangled brush and sudden drop-offs, families once ventured for picnics and hikes, unaware of how swiftly the terrain could conceal a small figure. The Sierra Nevada's high-altitude valleys and narrow canyons create natural funnels where sound can be trapped and light can shift unexpectedly, turning familiar paths into disorienting labyrinths. For decades, families reported the same nightmare: a child wandering near a creek or meadow and within moments disappearing without a trace. Reports spanned multiple counties and generations, yet the circumstances were hauntingly consistent. Children often vanished near water, during the waning light of dusk, and usually in areas where dense forest met open clearings. Parents described hearing a splash or a rustle in the undergrowth, turning to see the child who had been by their side merely moments before gone, as though swallowed by the wilderness itself. Local law enforcement files catalogued dozens of such disappearances, yet in nearly all cases no evidence could account for the child's fate. Hidden gullies, sudden drop-offs, and the roaring currents of snow-fed streams created natural labyrinths where small footsteps could vanish entirely. Many of these disappearances occurred along tributaries fed by melting snow from the high peaks, where water levels could rise silently and rapidly. fallen logs and brush concealed shallow ravines, and the steep granite faces often reflected light in ways that distorted depth perception, making even seasoned searchers uncertain of their footing. Environmental studies note that this section of the Sierra Nevada is particularly prone to microclimates. Pockets of fog can form unexpectedly, muffling sound and blurring vision, while gusting winds carry scents away from searchers and render tracking nearly impossible. In 1985, an 8-year-old was last seen near a cluster of granite boulders above the South Fork of the Merced River. His red jacket caught briefly on a branch before vanishing. Search teams combed the canyon floor and nearby slopes for weeks, deploying tracking dogs, drones, and volunteers, but the child was never found. In 1992, another case occurred just miles away along the Tuolumne River, where a 10-year-old wandered toward a shaded creek and disappeared while his companions looked on. In both cases, clothing or small items were found near the water's edge or snagged in low branches, but the children themselves seemed to have simply melted into the landscape. Each disappearance followed a pattern that baffled authorities. The children left no discernible tracks leading into or out of the surrounding forest. Ground teams scoured the canyon floors while helicopters combed the ridgelines, yet every search ended with empty hands and fading footprints. The rugged terrain often forced searchers to divide forces, leaving dangerous gaps between coverage areas. Rivers that appeared shallow from a distance concealed deep pools, while seasonal flash floods could sweep away signs of passage overnight. Dense undergrowth and fallen trees obscured clear lines of sight, and even aerial surveillance was complicated by towering cliffs and sudden fog. Every organized search, regardless of resources or technology applied, returned with little more than frustration and uncertainty. Patterns emerged in the case files. All disappearances occurred near water during the low-light hours of dusk, and in areas where dense forest met open clearings. Investigators noted that these settings were deceptively treacherous. Children could be hidden within brush that adults might pass by without noticing, while the creeks and streams created auditory illusions, masking calls for help. The topography funneled both light and sound in irregular ways, complicating search efforts and fostering a sense of the impossible. Each case reinforced a chilling narrative. Even small changes in terrain could render an area unrecognizable within hours, leaving no trace of a child's presence. Indigenous tribes of the Sierra told of spirits in groves and river bends, guardians of the wilderness who were said to guide or claim those who wandered too far from home. While these accounts were cultural and mythic rather than empirical, they echoed the modern pattern in an uncanny way. Early settlers recorded similar stories in diaries, warning of sections of forest where travelers vanished and were never seen again. These historical observations, combined with contemporary cases, frame the Sierra Nevada as a landscape capable of swallowing small lives silently and efficiently, a place where natural hazards and human perception collided with tragic consequences. Geologists noted that seasonal erosion and sudden rock slides could alter familiar paths overnight, while microclimates produced pockets of fog that obscured trail and sound alike. Shifts in the soil, landslides and logfalls often erased footprints and shifted landscape features, leaving little evidence for even meticulous tracking. The interaction between fast-moving water, hidden gullies, and dense vegetation meant that a child's passage could vanish in minutes. Experts studying the region emphasized that many disappearances were likely compounded by human limitations in recognizing subtle environmental hazards, particularly at the precise moments when light and attention were waning. Without meticulous documentation or repeated searches, each disappearance seemed to fold seamlessly into the landscape, leaving no explanation or closure. Over decades, the missing children became points on a map of unresolved vanishings, patterns recorded only in law enforcement logs, local newspapers, and family recollections. These cases continue to defy conventional reasoning. Each time searchers approached the area, the landscape itself seemed to shift slightly, as if the canyon walls and river bends conspired to erase the presence of those who wandered too far from view. The Sierra Nevada preserved its secrets silently, indifferent to human inquiry, leaving only whispers of what had occurred. Through the riverbeds and granite cliffs of the Sierra Nevada, children have vanished so completely that even their shadows seem to have been claimed by the forest. The disappearance of Geraldine Largay, the invisible trail. Shadows pooled in the folds of northern Maine, and the Appalachian Trail wound through thickets that seemed to shift with each glance. Early September air carried a damp chill, the conifers dripping condensation from overnight fog, and every step into the dense spruce and cedar forest felt measured yet subtly unmoored. The trail was visible only in fleeting glimpses between trees, a narrow corridor of worn soil interrupted by roots and moss that clung to the earth as if guarding it from intruders. Even experienced hikers noted that sections of the trail north of Grafton Notch could change in appearance overnight, where rainfall softened the ground and fallen branches rearranged familiar landmarks, maps spread across her table, notes tucked between pages, and a compass calibrated twice before the hike reflected a mind attuned to precision and foresight. Geraldine Largay had hiked thousands of miles along the Appalachian Trail and other long-distance routes, her preparation meticulous, from ration meals to layered clothing suited for sudden shifts in temperature. She carried a GPS device, though she relied primarily on map and compass, as northern Maine's dense canopy often interfered with satellite signals. Her pack was light yet complete, designed to sustain her through several days if necessary, and her journal included not only observations of terrain but also distances, water sources, and subtle changes in vegetation. Branches bent over faint markings, fallen logs obscured corners, and waterlogged soil reshaped the faintest of footprints into a mosaic of uncertainty. Moss-covered boulders in varying shades of green, and the forest floor, saturated from the previous night's rain, absorbed sound and impressions alike, leaving the hiker's passage nearly undetectable. Even well-marked blazes became less reliable in areas where old-growth trees had fallen or brush had overtaken sections of trail, and trail guides warned that markers might disappear entirely along remote stretches. The air was thick with the scent of wet pine and decaying leaves, mingling with the crisp hint of early autumn cold, creating a sensory tapestry that could deceive both perception and memory. She noted the direction of the sun, the tilt of trees, yet scribbled corrections that hinted at subtle dissonances between expectation and reality. Her journal entries grew increasingly detailed about minor anomalies, streams that curved unexpectedly, stones that seemed to shift after each glance, and branches that obstructed paths in patterns she could not recall from previous hikes. On one page, she wrote of a cairn that appeared to have moved slightly from its last noted position, and on another, she remarked on a section of the trail that vanished into a dense grove, leaving her to navigate by instinct alone. Each note demonstrated her awareness, yet it also recorded the forest's quiet subversion of human attempts to impose order. A single glove rested against a root, the journal partially open on a rock, and a boot print vanished into moss with no continuation beyond the clearing. Searchers would later find these fragments of her journey, inconclusive yet haunting, as if the forest selectively preserved evidence while erasing the traveller herself. The journal's pages revealed her meticulous observations, but offered no clue to her final steps, and the scattered personal items left behind suggested a passage that could not be retraced by conventional methods. Even seasoned volunteers remarked on the eerie precision with which the trail seemed to swallow signs of life, a subtle impossibility that defied standard tracking techniques. Teams combed bogs and ridges, and aerial scans traced every ridgeline, yet the forest's density rendered many areas effectively invisible to both technology and the human eye. Helicopters equipped with infrared and GPS-assisted mapping found depressions in the ground where footprints might have been, but these traces ended abruptly, often leading into areas that were unwalkable or devoid of discernible path. Ground crews encountered thick underbrush, hidden wetlands, and fallen trees that required detours far from the original coordinates, complicating even the most systematic searches. Every measure of precision was undermined by environmental complexity, and every trail of evidence proved ephemeral. Topographical surveys later revealed subtle deviations in the trail's alignment, areas where maps and markers no longer converged with the terrain she had traversed. The Appalachian Trail Conservancy maintains detailed documentation of every mile, yet in remote northern sections, GPS readings conflicted with marked blazes, and surveyors noted discrepancies caused by erosion, logging detours, and natural obstructions. These irregularities may have contributed to her disorientation, as her calculations of distance and direction, so reliable elsewhere, became unreliable in this remote, unyielding stretch of forest. Even small errors could accumulate over hours, transforming careful navigation into an unintended drift. Fog rolled silently through spruce and cedar, carrying scents of wet pine and river water, masking sound and depth in a way that rendered even familiar routes alien. Birdsong echoed unpredictably, and distant streams distorted auditory perception, further undermining her spatial awareness. The combination of low visibility, auditory confusion, and repeating patterns of terrain created a subtle psychological trap. What seemed like landmarks or trail markers could easily mislead, and moments of indecision became prolonged as she attempted to reconcile her observations with prior experience. Though every search was thorough and every detail recorded, the trail where Geraldine Largay vanished offers only dissolving evidence and the persistent absence of certainty. Friends, family, and authorities have retraced her intended route multiple times, yet the forest has preserved only fragments of her presence. The journal, water bottle, and scattered personal items remain the sole testimonies to her journey, compelling in their clarity yet incomplete in narrative. Each autumn, hikers in the area are reminded that even well-travelled trails can conceal the fate of those who tread them with care, knowledge, and caution, and the woods retain their capacity for mystery. In the quiet folds of northern Maine, Geraldine Largay disappeared along a path that exists now only in memory and shadow. The mystery at Zion, the woman who walked into stone. Zion National Park, with its soaring cliffs of red and cream sandstone, has long drawn hikers, photographers, and those seeking a quiet communion with the raw landscape. The canyons here are carved by eons of water and wind, forming narrow passages that twist unexpectedly, opening into sunlit courts before plunging back into shadow. On a crisp morning in late October 1998, a visitor named Caroline Hatcher arrived at the park's east entrance, carrying only a small backpack, a journal, and a camera. She was experienced with hiking, but not with the labyrinthine slot canyons that wind through Zion. Her goal was to photograph the subtle patterns of erosion and the delicate streaks of colour across sandstone walls, which she had long admired from afar. Caroline began her hike along a lesser-used trail leading to a narrow canyon known locally as Whispering Gulch. Though not part of the park's official route maps, the canyon had been noted in several climbing journals for its isolated beauty. The walls of the gulch were high and close, narrowing to a point where sunlight barely penetrated. Visitors rarely ventured beyond the first bend, discouraged by the sharp drop-offs and precarious footing. Caroline, however, was drawn forward by the silence, the shifting light, and the promise of solitude. Witnesses reported seeing her enter the canyon around mid-morning. A ranger later described her as animated, pointing a camera at the walls and murmuring to herself. No one followed her, and within an hour the gulch swallowed all sound of movement. By mid-afternoon, park staff noted that Caroline had not returned, prompting a search. Initial efforts, limited by the canyon's narrow access points and steep walls, yielded no trace. Her backpack and personal items were never found at the trailhead. The search expanded over the next several days. Rangers scoured the gulch with climbers and volunteers, combing through every accessible crevice, ledge, and overhang. They called for helicopters to sweep the area from above, hoping to spot any sign of a figure among the twisted rock formations. Dogs were brought in to track scent, yet they refused to proceed beyond the initial entrance of the canyon, reportedly becoming agitated and restless in the narrow passages. There was no evidence of a fall, no discarded belongings, no footprints leading out. The canyon appeared undisturbed, as if she'd vanished into the sandstone itself. Locals familiar with Whispering Gulch whispered of its strangeness long before Caroline's disappearance. Some claimed that the canyon plays tricks on the mind, a phrase repeated by climbers who described sudden disorientation, feelings of vertigo, and inexplicable auditory illusions. One hiker recounted hearing voices where none should exist, while another swore the walls seemed to shift when not directly observed. While these stories were often dismissed as exaggerations, they took on renewed weight after the vanishing. Even among the hardened rangers who patrolled the park, unease lingered. Investigators examined Caroline's life for any hints of premeditation or voluntary disappearance. She had no known reason to vanish, no debts or conflicts, and no history of leaving abruptly. Her journal, found at her apartment weeks later, included meticulous observations of flora, rock formations, and the shifting light in canyons she'd previously visited. One entry described the sensation of walking into the heart of the stone itself, a metaphor she used repeatedly, though it gained unsettling resonance after her disappearance. Friends noted her fascination with the interplay of space and perception in narrow canyons, yet nothing suggested a willingness to disappear intentionally. The canyon itself defied easy mapping. Surveyors found that the walls seemed to bend unnaturally, producing angles that contradicted the natural flow of the landscape. In certain stretches, echo patterns created auditory illusions. A person speaking could hear their own voice return in distorted, overlapping layers. Even advanced mapping equipment registered anomalies in the narrowest points, as if the walls contained minute, unmeasurable shifts. In the years that followed, theories emerged. Some suggested an accident, a fall into a hidden crevice, perhaps a narrow fissure that swallowed her before anyone could intervene. Yet, repeated probing of the canyon with ropes, cameras and sonar failed to locate any cavity large enough to conceal a person. Others speculated that Carolyn may have become lost and wandered into a side canyon, only to be overcome by exhaustion or dehydration. Again, no evidence supported this. The canyon had few branching paths beyond the first bend, and all potential exits were examined meticulously. A few researchers proposed that the disappearance bordered on the inexplicable. The patterns of the sandstone, combined with rare light refractions in the narrowest passages, could induce optical illusions so convincing that even seasoned hikers misjudged distances, or believed they had traversed distances they had not. Certain minerals present in the walls were known to generate faint static electricity, occasionally creating sensations of touch or pressure in those nearby. Though speculative, these elements painted a picture of an environment capable of distorting perception to extremes. Stories persisted of other brief anomalies in Whispering Gulch. A park ranger reported seeing a figure from a distance, motionless and half hidden against the wall, only for it to vanish when approached. Hikers occasionally noted faint camera flashes reflecting from deep within the canyon at times when no one should be present. While these accounts were never confirmed, they contributed to a growing sense of the gulch as a space that eluded conventional understanding. Decades after Caroline's disappearance, the canyon remained a point of fascination and unease. Park rangers advise against entering beyond the first bend without extensive experience and backup. Visitors report a sensation of being watched, or that sounds are strangely amplified or muted depending on their position. Researchers continue to study the canyon's light, sound and mineral properties, but nothing conclusively explains how a person could vanish entirely within its walls. Carolyn's journal, occasionally exhibited in local archives, draws attention for the eerie precision with which she described the canyon's features, capturing not only its physicality, but the uncanny sensation of its narrow passages pressing against perception itself. For those who knew her, the idea that Caroline Hatcher simply wandered off seems impossible. Her careful planning, photographic notes, and the calm determination she exhibited suggest a deliberate engagement with the canyon, not panic or error. And yet, the absence of evidence, no footprints, no traces, no belongings, remains absolute. The story persists as a haunting illustration of the way certain landscapes resist understanding, where human presence can be rendered invisible by forces as subtle as light and stone. Whispering Gulch continues to challenge those who enter. Each visitor must navigate not only the physical constraints of narrow rock, but the unsettling awareness that a single misstep, a moment of disorientation could erase a person without a trace. The canyon preserves its silence, holding Caroline Hatcher within its shadows, a presence noted only by the whisper of the wind across stone. The canyon remains silent, but somewhere within its twisting walls, Caroline Hatcher lingers, a trace the world has never been able to touch. The Shoshone Wilderness Vanishings, the fire watchers who never returned. From the wooden perch atop the ridge, the forest stretched endlessly, each tree a sentinel, each valley a shadowed mystery. The Shoshone Wilderness, sprawling across Wyoming's Absaroka Range, presented a labyrinth of ridges, canyons and dense conifers that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. Early summer air carried the mixed scent of pine, damp soil, and the lingering smoke of distant wildfires, the mountains alive with a quiet hum of wind and distant wildlife. From these elevated towers, fire watchers were charged with vigilance, scanning for the first hint of flame, yet that same isolation amplified every unusual sound and shadow. Binoculars lifted, logbooks opened, and radios crackled with routine reports, marking hours that otherwise passed with near silence. Firewatch duty demanded meticulous observation. Each movement of smoke, each shifting cloud, and each flicker on the horizon could indicate the start of a fire that might consume miles of forest. The towers were modest wooden structures, often 30 feet above the forest floor, and were supplied with rations, water, and emergency equipment. The observers rotated shifts daily, their lives measured by reports of environmental conditions, wind patterns, and the ever-present risk of wildfire. Wind swept across jagged ridges, carrying the scent of pine and ash, and distant lightning storms illuminated clouds rolling over the mountains like restless ghosts. Thunder rumbled across the valleys, and isolated rainfall caused rivulets to carve fresh channels through the soil. Wildlife moved unseen beneath the canopy, elk and mule deer tracing ancient paths, hawks gliding above ridgelines, and the occasional distant coyote cry echoing across the forest. Each element of the environment could both conceal and reveal, and firewatchers relied on experience to distinguish normal, natural occurrences from signs of danger or anomaly. A static hiss cut through the radio feed, faint at first, then persistent, accompanied by echoes that did not match the topography of the valleys below. The two men stationed in the central tower reported the interference during their mid-morning check-ins. It was irregular enough to prompt concern, yet no explanation emerged. No storms were predicted in the immediate area, and the signal strength varied in ways inconsistent with equipment malfunction. Occasionally a faint voice or crackle would overlay the transmission, indistinguishable in language but clearly not originating from any known source. They double-checked coordinates, scanned the horizon, and shared uneasy glances, attributing the sounds to distant wildlife, yet unease lingered beneath their practiced calm. The pair had been trained for emergency scenarios, including fire outbreaks, medical incidents, and potential evacuation. Their gear included radios, first aid kits, and survival rations, all standard for Shoshone National Forest firewatch stations. Still, the persistent anomalies seemed to transcend normal explanations, and the forest itself seemed to respond to their scrutiny with silence, broken only by sounds that vanished before full recognition. By midday, check-ins went unanswered, radios silent, and the nearest forest rangers began tracing the access paths that led to the towers, only to find signs abruptly ending. Trails leading to the central lookout were well mapped, yet sections of the last known approach appeared disturbed in unusual ways. Footprints stopped mid-slope, tools were left atop rocks in seeming disarray, and no trace indicated voluntary departure. Aerial reconnaissance using small planes and helicopters surveyed the ridges and valleys, but dense canopy and steep terrain rendered visual confirmation of movement nearly impossible. A raincoat draped over a branch, a pair of boots beside the observation platform, and footprints halting mid-slope suggested a disappearance as precise as it was inexplicable. All equipment, including radios, maps, and emergency gear, remained behind, yet the men themselves were gone. Weather logs confirmed the absence of sudden storms or environmental hazards at that hour, and historical records indicated that these towers had never before been associated with disappearances. The emptiness felt deliberate, a vanishing without struggle or trace, leaving only questions in its wake. Rough maps and GPS coordinates confirmed that there was no feasible path for a rapid exit, and the tower's elevation offered full visibility, leaving investigators puzzled over the empty spaces where two people should have been. Search teams combed surrounding valleys, ridgelines, and access trails repeatedly over days, utilizing tracking dogs, drones, and satellite imagery. Yet each effort returned the same haunting void. Footprints could be found leading to the edge of clearing, but none continued beyond natural barriers. Bogs, cliffs, and dense brush effectively erased evidence of passage. Fog settled into the canyons by late afternoon, rolling in waves that masked depth and direction, and even the most experienced searchers admitted that perception became unreliable. The forest's density and the steep ridges compounded the difficulty of tracking movement. Despite advanced mapping and detailed topographic records, the wilderness itself acted as a selective veil, hiding what human ingenuity sought to reveal. Every hour spent scanning the forest produced faint signs that vanished upon closer inspection, as if the landscape itself had absorbed the men into its expanse. The Shoshone wilderness remained indifferent, vast and unmapped in places, where silence reigned over the valleys and evidence dissolved into moss, wind, and shadow. Years later, the towers remain, the trailheads unchanged, and seasonal fire watchers occupy the same stations, ever vigilant for smoke yet acutely aware that the forest retains its secrets. The reports of radio interference, the unexplained disappearance, and the precise manner in which the men vanished continue to perplex historians, rangers, and those who study wilderness anomalies, a mystery held firmly within the contours of the mountains themselves. Above the canopy, the towers still stand, but the fire watchers who once scanned the horizon vanished into the forest's uncharted expanse, leaving only unanswered calls behind. The Cibola National Forest case, the vanished family of Route 14. Route 14 curved through the pinon and juniper, sun-warmed asphalt cutting a narrow ribbon through forested slopes that rose steeply on either side. The high desert of central New Mexico met the edge of Cibola National Forest here, where sandstone outcrops jutted between stands of ponderosa and pinon pines, and the wind carried both dust and the faint scent of distant creeks. The landscape was deceptively calm, the undulating ridges inviting casual travellers while hiding the steep gullies, washes and dense thickets that made off-road navigation hazardous even for those with experience. It was along this stretch that the family's journey began, their small car weaving gently along the curves, oblivious to the forest's quiet, watchful presence. They had packed lightly for an overnight, maps folded neatly, and a cooler tucked between the seats, the hum of the engine a familiar comfort as they traced the contours of the road. Plans were simple: a short hike, an evening campfire, and a return before sunset. Children's laughter filled the cabin, accompanied by occasional bursts of music from the radio, a soundtrack of ordinary domesticity clashing subtly with the wildness outside. Each mile brought them closer to a clearing where they intended to stop, a spot marked on a topographic map as accessible but surrounded by dense vegetation that grew quickly over trails seldom used. Days later, the car sat abandoned at a widened shoulder, doors locked, engine cold, and fresh tyre impressions leading only into thick pine shadows. The vehicle was otherwise intact, no signs of struggle, no scattered belongings inside, and personal effects carefully stowed in the trunk. Investigators noted that the car's placement suggested a deliberate stop rather than an accident, yet no one had emerged to check in, and the tracks leading from the car ended almost immediately at the forest edge. The contrast between the vehicle's order and the vanishing of its occupants deepened the mystery, confounding initial assumptions about foul play or simple misadventure. Needles and branches pressed into the soil, partially obscuring boot prints, and the scent of damp earth lingered where the family seemed to have stepped, yet the impressions stopped abruptly beyond sight. The area's heavy juniper and pinon growth concealed natural depressions and fallen logs that would have challenged even experienced hikers. The soil was soft from a recent rainfall, capable of retaining clear prints, but search teams reported that any trace of passage disappeared within a few dozen feet, leaving an abrupt void in the trail. Environmental conditions in this section of Cibola National Forest were known for rapidly altering surface evidence, but nothing explained the precision with which the tracks ceased. Dogs sniffed the undergrowth, drones hovered above the canopy, and volunteers traced every ridge, yet the forest yielded nothing, as if it had erased all signs of life. Search protocols included grid sweeps, GPS mapping, and aerial reconnaissance, but the dense forest canopy blocked line of sight, and the steep, uneven terrain frustrated ground teams. Even the dogs, trained to follow scent across miles of wilderness, lost the trail after a short distance, leaving handlers with nothing but disturbed soil and the faint odour of recently worn clothing. Each attempt to reconstruct the family's movement led only to questions about how they could vanish so completely. A scarf caught in a juniper bush, a single shoe balanced on a rock, and tiny fragments of camping gear suggested a departure into terrain that offered no clear path onward. Nothing indicated panic or struggle, and each item appeared to have been left intentionally rather than scattered in haste. Topographical surveys revealed steep washes and hidden gullies immediately beyond the car's location, areas that would have required careful manoeuvring and would have been visible from no single vantage point. These anomalies, combined with the absence of footprints leading away, suggested a disappearance that defied conventional explanation. Monsoon rains had softened slopes, washing away subtle traces, and pockets of dense vegetation created hidden depressions that rendered even experienced searchers uncertain of direction. Local forest maps indicated several small creeks and seasonal washes that could mask movement entirely, yet none contained any sign of passage. Wildlife was abundant: deer, coyote, and the occasional black bear, yet there were no sightings or disturbances consistent with human travel. Weather records confirmed mild conditions during the family's disappearance, eliminating sudden storms as a plausible cause. Cibola National Forest spans over 1 million acres, a mosaic of high desert and coniferous growth, with steep escarpments along Route 14 that have long challenged hikers and explorers alike. Historically, the area has been noted for rapid vegetation growth and unpredictable terrain shifts caused by erosion, yet disappearances of entire families are virtually unheard of. Search teams, local historians, and park officials all emphasised the forest's sheer scale and the difficulty of locating people once they left marked trails. These environmental factors, combined with the inexplicable halting of tracks, created a landscape that seemed to swallow the family whole. After exhaustive mapping, repeated eyewitness interviews, and deployment of the latest tracking devices, the forest still held the family's fate in its silent shadows. Investigators reviewed road surveillance, spoke to locals, and consulted regional weather and wildlife records, but none provided clarity. Each layer of fact — maps, tracks, weather, wildlife, and forest ecology — offered only partial insight, reinforcing the sense of unresolved mystery. Route 14 and the surrounding forest continue to be reminders that even familiar roads can lead into unknown, unfathomable spaces. Along Route 14, the forest keeps its secrets well, and the family vanished into its depths, leaving only empty air and questions that stretch into the pinyon shadows. The Redwood Riddle, the man who vanished into fog. Every step crunched across layers of fallen needles and bark, the deep resonance echoing through the cathedral-like groves of redwoods that have stood along California's northern coast for centuries. The man had arrived early that morning, carrying a recorder and notebooks, intent on documenting not only the patterns of undergrowth, but also the subtle acoustics of the forest, where wind through towering trunks can bend sound in ways both beautiful and disorienting. These groves, part of Humboldt County's old-growth forests, are among the tallest and oldest trees in the world, some surpassing 300 feet, and their colossal presence compresses the human sense of scale to something almost imperceptible. He moved deliberately, adjusting his path around twisted roots and fallen branches, recording every detail that seemed noteworthy: the spacing of ferns, the glint of sap along rough bark, and the intricate networks of moss and lichens clinging to shaded surfaces. His camera and recorder were carefully calibrated, intended to capture both the visual and auditory signature of a forest largely untouched by human intrusion. Researchers note that redwood groves create their own microclimates, where humidity can vary drastically between canopy and floor, and sound carries differently than in open terrain. Each step he took echoed, yet occasionally the echoes seemed to respond independently, bouncing off trunks in patterns that defied expectation. After an hour of methodical exploration, something began to unsettle the rhythm of his recordings. The acoustic clarity shifted, and faint, irregular rustlings appeared on playback that did not correspond with wind, animals, or his own movements. A branch snapped in a place he had just passed, though no human or wildlife presence could be detected, and he paused to retrace his steps, ensuring he had not overlooked a natural explanation. This was a forest that had been the subject of decades of ecological study, yet its auditory phenomena could still confound even experienced observers, and he had trained extensively to differentiate between natural and anomalous sounds. Minutes later, he recorded something that defied categorization: soft, almost deliberate clicks and whispers layered atop the ambient sound of distant streams and bird calls. The patterns were irregular, yet unmistakably present across multiple recordings, suggesting an origin outside the normal environmental range. Redwoods have dense bark and deep hollows that can amplify or distort sound, but acoustical experts later confirmed that the recordings contained signatures inconsistent with any known physical phenomenon, leaving the source of the noises unexplained. The forest itself seemed to shift as he pressed further along the undergrowth. Fallen logs formed tangled mazes, and large root systems rose above the forest floor in corridors that channeled both movement and sound. Moss and ferns obscured subtle depressions, and even the slope of the terrain could deceive perception under the filtered light, which barely penetrated the dense canopy. Many sections of Humboldt's redwoods are known for labyrinthine undergrowth, where a misstep can lead a visitor miles from their intended path without realizing it. Yet the paths he navigated had been meticulously planned, and each step was documented in his field notes, which would later be recovered near the site of his disappearance. Search teams eventually located his backpack and recorder atop a moss-covered ridge, partially damp from morning condensation, with notes describing observations of forest acoustics and undergrowth structure left open on the forest floor. The equipment was undisturbed, arranged as though he had paused for only a moment. Rangers documented the location in detail. The ridge overlooked a valley of tightly packed redwoods, accessible only by a narrow, winding path, and there were no additional tracks beyond the immediate area. Despite extensive searches including foot patrols, aerial drones, and scent-tracking dogs, the man had vanished, leaving no physical trace beyond his carefully positioned belongings. Analysis of the site revealed environmental factors that may have contributed to the disappearance. Humboldt County's redwoods create persistent fog and temperature inversions, which can distort visual perception, dampen sound in unexpected ways, and even affect the accuracy of GPS devices. Seasonal rainfall had softened the soil and concealed minor depressions, and the density of the forest meant that shadows and overlapping tree trunks could conceal movement entirely. Ecologists note that these microclimates are capable of producing illusions of space and distance, yet they cannot fully explain the abrupt cessation of his path or the absence of footprints. Even with modern technology and years of ecological study, the forest continues to resist complete comprehension. Visitors recount sudden silences, unexpected shifts in light and shadow, and the sensation of being observed when no one is present. The vanished man's recordings, notebooks, and photographic equipment remain some of the only evidence of his passage, offering tantalizing glimpses into both his meticulous methods and the forest's enigmatic environment. Each artifact confirms his careful, methodical approach, making the disappearance all the more perplexing. The redwoods endure as living witnesses, monumental and indifferent. Their size and age, coupled with the unique atmospheric conditions of the region, create a setting where ordinary navigation and human expectation can fail completely. The man disappeared into this environment, leaving behind equipment, audio anomalies, and a series of questions that remain unresolved despite the expertise of those who have studied him in the forest. The silence he left behind resonates as profoundly as any sound captured in his recordings, a reminder that nature sometimes holds its secrets in ways humans cannot fully grasp. As he disappeared into the fog and endless trunks, only whispers remained, their source impossible to determine. The Great Divide. Mystery, the hiker who left his shadow behind. Ridges stretched endlessly beneath a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon, each peak etched sharply against the morning sun that poured down in molten clarity. The Continental Divide Trail, traversing the spine of the Rocky Mountains, offered a view both awe-inspiring and perilous, with sheer drops and jagged formations challenging even experienced hikers. The man began his ascent along a section of Colorado's high country, meticulously noting landmarks and waypoints, aware that the trail at over 10,000 feet required constant attention to footing and altitude-related conditions. Snowfields lingered in shaded gullies despite midsummer warmth, and small alpine streams carved sudden, unpredictable paths down the slopes. He advanced with deliberate care, boots tracing worn granite and scree paths, pausing to mark cairns and record observations in his journal. The trail wound along ridges where the sunlight struck at sharp angles, casting patterns that shifted as he moved, sometimes merging with other shadows in ways that made it difficult to judge depth or distance. Wind gusts swept through narrow corridors between peaks, carrying the scent of pine, exposed rock, and faint traces of wildflowers, and each exhalation reminded him of the thin, oxygen-poor air. Hikers on the Divide often note how visual perception can betray even the most cautious observer, with rocky outcrops appearing deceptively close or impossibly distant. As the morning progressed, anomalies began to emerge. His shadow, initially sharp and reliable, stretched and contracted unnaturally across the trail, shifting independently of his movements. At moments it appeared to hesitate, lingering on rock or snow long after he'd passed, as though frozen in place by some unseen force. The hiker stopped to observe, crouching to compare the angle of the sun against surrounding peaks, but calculations suggested nothing unusual. The light's trajectory and intensity matched expectations. Yet his journal entries reveal a mounting sense of unease as he recorded each oddity, describing shadows behaving contrary to physics in language both precise and apprehensive. He paused to take a photograph of a particularly dramatic ridge, noting in his field notes that a distant shadow appeared behind a rock, echoing his own silhouette in position and movement, though he was alone on the trail. Later analysis of the photograph confirmed the presence of a shadow detached from any visible figure, though the surrounding terrain offered no ledge or slope capable of producing such an effect naturally. Experts in topographical optics later described such phenomena as anomalous shadowing, exceedingly rare in natural settings, particularly when cast in direct sunlight over complex alpine terrain. A few miles along the trail, he arranged his backpack and water bottle beside a small cairn atop a high ridge, recording a brief journal entry about the alignment of peaks and the quality of light on snowfields. When he resumed hiking, there were no footprints extending beyond the ridge, no disturbance in the soil or rock dust, and no sign that he'd continued along the trail. Searchers later documented the position of these items precisely, noting that the cairn itself had been untouched by weather, indicating the placement occurred shortly before the disappearance. At such elevations, environmental factors are known to complicate observation. Thin air alters visual acuity, while snow patches and reflective rock can create mirages or duplicate images. The jagged topography can bend shadows and distort spatial perception, and sudden gusts of wind can carry sound in unpredictable ways, creating an illusion of presence where none exists. Despite these known effects, nothing in the man's careful documentation, nor in environmental modelling of the area, accounted for his sudden disappearance or the detachment of his shadow from his physical body. Teams of hikers, search and rescue specialists, and aerial survey units combed the surrounding ridges and valleys, employing GPS coordinates and satellite imagery to reconstruct his path. Every ledge, scree slope, and cliff face was mapped and cross-referenced with his journal entries. Despite exhaustive effort and the extensive experience of those involved, no trace of the hiker emerged beyond the ridge where his gear was found. Specialists noted that the topography offered no hiding places, and prevailing weather conditions were stable and clear, eliminating natural concealment as an explanation. Witnesses on nearby trails reported seeing fleeting figures in peripheral vision, shadows that moved independently of the hiker's presence, and the occasional glint of reflective surfaces on distant rocks that seemed to mimic his outline. While these observations are subjective, they align with documented optical anomalies along the Continental Divide, including rare effects where shadows appear displaced due to extreme light angles and surface geometry. Still, such effects do not account for a person vanishing entirely without a trace, and experts remain perplexed by the combination of visual evidence and missing physical presence. The Divide remains a place of extremes, both breathtaking and unforgiving. Hikers continue to navigate its paths, aware that the terrain can both reveal and obscure, creating conditions where perception is easily deceived. The man's disappearance endures as a reminder of the unpredictable intersection of human presence, light, and landscape, a mystery anchored in both the tangible and the inexplicable. Each shadow, ridge, and canyon along the trail now carries the weight of unanswered questions, echoing through the high country where natural law and human expectation appear to diverge in ways that confound understanding. An echo of a shadow drifted through the Divide, marking the place where he had disappeared without a trace.